The nightmare always started the same way. Mason Coleman stood in the middle of a battlefield smoke, hanging thick in the air, the smell of gunpowder and blood filling his nostrils. Bodies lay scattered around him, Union blue and Confederate gray, indistinguishable under the layer of mud and gore. But it was the silence that haunted him most, the unnatural quiet after hours of cannon fire and screaming men. He moved forward, his boots sinking into the soft earth, searching for survivors. Then he heard it, a soft whimper to his right. A young soldier no more than 17 lay with his chest torn open, eyes wide with fear. "Help me," the boy whispered, reaching up with a bloodied hand. Mason knelt beside him, pressing his hands against the wound, knowing it was futile. "Hold on, son. Help's coming." But they both knew it was a lie. The boy's eyes suddenly shifted, looking past Mason's shoulder. "Sir, behind you." Mason turned to see a tall figure emerging from the smoke. Captain Roland Blackwood. His commanding officer stood with his saber-drawn face splattered with blood that wasn't his own. "Leave him, Coleman," Blackwood ordered. "We've got a village to clear." "Village?" Mason questioned, still pressing on the boy's wound. "The battle's over, sir." Blackwood's face twisted into a cruel smile. "Not for the Indians hiding our deserters. Orders are to make an example of them." Mason stood blocking Blackwood's path. "They're civilians, sir. Women and children." "They're savages," Blackwood spat. "Now fall in, or I'll have you shot for insubordination." The scene shifted, and suddenly Mason was standing at the edge of an Apache village. Screams filled the air as soldiers torched dwellings and dragged people from their homes. A young Apache woman ran past him, a child in her arms. Blackwood appeared from nowhere, raising his pistol. "No!" Mason lunged forward, grabbing Blackwood's arm. The gun discharged the bullet, grazing Mason's neck, instead of hitting its intended target. Blackwood's face contorted with rage. He brought the butt of his pistol down hard against Mason's temple. "You'll pay for that, Coleman." As Mason fell to his knees, the world spinning around him, he saw the young Apache woman staring back at him, her eyes filled not with gratitude, but accusation. "You didn't stop them. You didn't save us." The thunder crashed outside, jolting Mason awake. He sat up in bed, gasping for breath, his hand instinctively reaching for the scar on his neck, the permanent reminder of his final confrontation with Blackwood. Sweat soaked his nightshirt, despite the cool autumn air that slipped through the cracks in the cabin walls. The nightmare had returned more vivid than ever. Mason swung his legs over the side of the bed, listening to the storm rage outside. The wooden beams of his small cabin creaked under the force of the wind. 3 years he'd lived here on the edge of the New Mexico territory, and still the place felt temporary, as if he was just passing through. Perhaps that was the point, to never again lay down roots deep enough to hurt when they were torn away. Lightning flashed, illuminating the sparse interior, a table with a single chair, a cast-iron stove, a trunk containing what few possessions he'd kept after selling everything in Texas. On the wall hung his Remington rifle, and beside the bed stood a small table with a lantern and a framed photograph. In the brief flare of lightning, Sarah's face stared back at him forever, frozen in a formal studio portrait taken a year before their marriage. Before the war. Before the fever took her while he was still 1,000 miles away fighting someone else's battle. Mason reached for the bottle of whiskey he kept under the bed, taking a long pull before returning it to its hiding place. The liquor burned down his throat, familiar and numbing. He'd been trying to drink less these past months, knowing that drowning himself wouldn't bring Sarah back or wash away the blood he'd seen spilled. He pulled on his trousers and a worn flannel shirt, not bothering with boots. The wooden floor was cold beneath his bare feet as he moved to the window, pushing aside the rough burlap curtain. The storm had intensified, rain lashing against the glass, wind howling through the junipers that dotted the rocky landscape. In the distance, lightning illuminated the rugged hills that separated his small plot of land from the nearest town, a good 20 miles of rough country. Mason listened intently, hearing a sound that didn't belong to the storm. A nervous whinny from the small corral beside the cabin. Storm was restless. The black gelding had been with him since the final year of the war, a cavalry horse Mason had purchased when mustering out. The animal had saved his life during his last battle, carrying him away from Confederate lines, after Mason's unit had been ambushed. More than just transportation, Storm was the only living thing Mason had allowed himself to depend on since Sarah's death. Despite the rain, Mason grabbed his coat from the hook by the door and stepped outside onto the covered porch. The wind immediately whipped at his clothes, the rain blowing sideways under the porch roof. He squinted through the darkness toward the corral, where Storm paced nervously, tossing his head. "Easy, boy!" Mason called, though his voice was lost in the howling wind. He descended the porch steps, mud squelching between his toes, as he made his way to the corral. Storm came to the fence, nostrils flaring, eyes wide, with an anxiety Mason had rarely seen in the battle-tested animal. "What is it?" Mason ran a hand down Storm's wet neck, feeling the muscles twitch beneath his touch. "Just thunder. You've heard worse from cannon fire." But the horse wasn't spooked by the storm. His ears were pricked forward, attention fixed on the darkness beyond the property toward the hills. Mason followed the animal's gaze, squinting against the rain. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a shadow darker than the night itself, slipping between the junipers on the hillside. Another flash of lightning revealed nothing but rain-drenched terrain. Mason patted Storm's neck again. "Nothing out there but ghosts, old friend." Yet, as he returned to the cabin, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in the night, some invisible balance disturbed. He checked the loading of his Remington before setting it back on its pegs, then bolted the door, an unusual precaution for a man who lived miles from his nearest neighbor. Sleep eluded him for the remainder of the night. He sat in the chair by the window, watching the storm rage, and then gradually subside as dawn approached. His hand occasionally drifted to the inside pocket of his coat, where Sarah's last letter remained folded and worn thin from constant handling. He didn't need to read it anymore. Every word was etched into his memory. "I'm waiting for you to come home, my love." Words that would never be fulfilled. As the first gray light filtered through the clouds, Mason finally rose and prepared for the day ahead. He built up the fire in the stove, put coffee on to boil, and sliced a piece of salt pork to fry for breakfast. The routine was comforting in its simplicity, one of the few things he'd managed to rebuild after everything else had crumbled. With daylight strengthening, Mason pulled on his boots and went outside to check on Storm. The air smelled fresh after the rain, sage and pine washing away the lingering scent of wood smoke that usually hung around the cabin. Puddles dotted the yard, reflecting the lightening sky. Mason stopped dead at the corral fence. The gate stood open, swinging slightly in the morning breeze. The corral was empty. For a long moment, Mason simply stared, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. Storm never bolted. The horse had stayed with him through gunfire, through lightning storms far worse than last night's, through everything life had thrown at them. Moving slowly as if in a dream, Mason approached the open gate. The rope that secured it hung loose, the knot undone. He examined it carefully. The rope hadn't broken. It had been untied. Either by human hands or by Storm himself, the horse had always been clever about escaping enclosures when he chose to. But why would he choose to now after 3 years? Mason knelt studying the ground. The rain had softened the earth, and Storm's hoofprints were clearly visible, leading away from the corral toward the hills. There were no other tracks, no sign of strangers or rustlers. Just Storm moving at what appeared to be a fast trot, heading east. "Damn it!" Mason muttered, straightening up. Without Storm, he was effectively stranded. 20 miles to town was a long walk, especially with supplies to carry back. But more than the practicalities, it was the abandonment that cut deep. The last creature he'd allowed himself to trust had left him. Mason tracked the hoofprints as far as he could, following them to where the soft earth gave way to rocky ground. There the trail vanished. He stood at the edge of his property, scanning the horizon, seeing nothing but juniper, pinon pine, and the vast empty landscape of the territory. "Storm!" he called, his voice echoing off the distant hills. Only silence answered. Mason returned to the cabin, shoulders heavy with an emotion he didn't want to name. He had lost too much already to acknowledge another absence. Instead, he focused on practicalities, mentally inventorying his supplies. He had food enough for 2 weeks' water from the well, ammunition for hunting. He could survive without riding into town immediately. But the cabin felt emptier than ever as he moved through his daily tasks. Each creak of the wind made him look up, expecting to hear the familiar sound of hooves. By afternoon, a hollow feeling had settled in his chest, the same emptiness he'd carried from Texas after burying Sarah in soil too dry to grow the flowers she had loved. As daylight faded, Mason found himself reaching for the whiskey bottle again. He sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and gold, the bottle dangling between his fingers. He hadn't taken a drink in almost 2 months, but tonight the temptation was strong, the liquid promising temporary escape from the weight of accumulating losses. "To absent friends," he murmured, raising the bottle. Before it reached his lips, a sound caught his attention, faint but unmistakable in the evening stillness. Hoofbeats approaching from the east. Mason set the bottle down, rising to his feet. Hope and caution warred within him as he moved off the porch, squinting into the gathering dusk. A dark shape materialized from the shadows of the hillside, moving slowly across the open ground toward the cabin. Storm. But not just Storm. As the horse drew closer, Mason could see a figure slumped over the animal's neck, clinging to the mane. A woman dressed in what appeared to be a deerskin dress adorned with intricate beadwork, now torn and muddied. Her black hair hung loose around her shoulders, and even from a distance Mason could see the dark stain of blood on her upper arm. Storm stopped about 20 yards from the cabin sides, heaving foam flecking his neck and chest. The woman raised her head slowly, revealing a face marked by exhaustion, but dominated by eyes that burned with intensity. Apache eyes, Mason realized with a jolt that sent him back to his nightmare. In one fluid motion, despite her injury, she slid from Storm's back and stood facing Mason. Her bare feet planted firmly in the mud, she straightened her spine and lifted her chin. The gesture wasn't one of surrender or pleading, it was defiance. Mason became acutely aware of the Remington hanging on the wall inside. He hadn't brought a weapon onto the porch, hadn't expected to need one. Now he stood exposed, facing an Apache woman who had appeared from nowhere on his missing horse. His hand instinctively moved to the scar on his neck, the memory of Blackwood and the village suddenly fresh again. Storm snorted, tossing his head, then did something Mason had never seen before. The horse moved to stand between them, as if protecting both from each other. For a long moment, neither human spoke. The only sounds were Storm's heavy breathing, the soft evening wind, and somewhere in the distance the cry of a hunting hawk, returning to its nest. In that suspended moment, Mason felt the trajectory of his solitary life shift, pulled by forces as inevitable as gravity. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice rough from disuse. "You're hurt." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, assessing him. She didn't respond, but her right hand moved to cover the wound on her left shoulder. "I'm not going to harm you," Mason said, keeping his voice even. "But I need to know why my horse brought you here." She glanced at Storm, then back at Mason. "Horse," she said, the word heavily accented but recognizable. "Find me." Her English was limited, but the meaning was clear enough. Storm had found her, not the other way around. The idea that his horse had deliberately sought her out and brought her back seemed impossible. Yet the evidence stood before him. Storm, who rarely tolerated strangers, now stood protective beside her. Mason took a careful step forward. The woman tensed, but didn't retreat. "You're bleeding," he said, gesturing to her shoulder. "I can help." She remained still, her eyes never leaving his face. The intensity of her gaze was unsettling, not fear as he might have expected, but a wary calculation. She was deciding whether to trust him, weighing the danger he represented against the wound that needed tending. Finally, she gave a small nod. "Come inside," Mason said, gesturing toward the cabin. "I've got supplies." He turned and walked back to the porch, not looking to see if she followed. The creak of the wooden steps behind him confirmed she had made her decision. Mason held the door open, and she passed inside close enough that he could smell the scent of sage and earth that clung to her clothing. Storm remained in the yard watching them. Mason gave the horse a long look before closing the door. "Sit," he said, pointing to the single chair by the table. The woman complied, moving with a careful grace that suggested she was concealing pain. Now, in the light of the cabin, Mason could see the wound more clearly, a deep graze across her upper arm, the flesh angry and red around the torn edges. A bullet wound, he realized. Someone had shot at her. Mason retrieved a wooden box from beneath his bed, a medical kit left over from his army days. Inside were bandages, a small bottle of whiskey for disinfecting a needle, and catgut for stitching wounds. He'd used it on himself more than once over the years. He set the box on the table and looked at the woman. "I need to clean the wound. It will hurt." She met his gaze steadily and pulled the torn fabric away from her shoulder, exposing the injury fully. The bullet had gouged a furrow through the flesh, but hadn't lodged in the muscle. A lucky miss. Mason poured some whiskey onto a clean cloth and hesitated. "What's your name?" The question seemed to surprise her. After a moment she replied, "Sina." Mason nodded. "Mason Coleman." He gestured with the cloth. "This will sting." When he pressed the alcohol-soaked cloth against the wound, Sina inhaled sharply, but made no sound. Her knuckles whitened where she gripped the edge of the table, but she didn't flinch away. Mason worked in silence, cleaning the wound thoroughly, then wrapping it with a bandage. The injury wouldn't require stitches or relief, as he had no talent for sewing flesh. Throughout the procedure, Sina watched him with those same intense eyes, tracking every movement of his hands. When he finished, he stepped back, returning the supplies to the box. "Hungry?" Sina nodded, the first hint of vulnerability crossing her face. Mason moved to the stove, adding wood to build up the heat, then retrieved a pot of beans he'd cooked that morning. He spooned a generous portion into a tin plate and set it before her, along with a chunk of cornbread and a mug of water. Sina stared at the food for a long moment, then looked up at him, suspicion clear in her expression. Mason understood. He took a small bite of the cornbread, then a spoonful of the beans, demonstrating they weren't poisoned. Only then did she begin to eat with controlled movements that couldn't fully disguise her hunger. While she ate, Mason moved to the window, watching Storm in the yard. The horse had moved to the water trough and was drinking deeply. He appeared exhausted, but uninjured wherever he had gone. He'd been ridden hard to return so quickly. "Who shot at you?" Mason asked without turning around. Sina didn't immediately answer. When he looked back at her, she had stopped eating, her hand tightening around the spoon. "Hunt men," she said finally. "White men, hunt people. Bounty hunters. Or worse." Mason had heard rumors in town of tensions rising again between settlers and the Apache. The army had forced many onto reservations, but some bands still lived free in the more remote areas. There were men who made their living tracking down renegades for the bounties offered by territorial authorities. Mason felt a familiar twist of disgust. He'd seen enough killing during the war to last several lifetimes. "Why are they hunting you?" Sina's expression hardened. "I run. They not like when we run." There was more to the story. Mason could sense it in the careful way she chose her limited words, but he didn't press. Everyone had the right to their secrets. God knew he had enough of his own. "You can stay tonight," he said, the decision forming even as he spoke it. "Rest. Your horse needs it too." A flicker of surprise crossed her face. "My horse?" "Storm found you. Brought you here." Mason shrugged. "Seems he chose you." Sina looked toward the window to where Storm could be seen in the yard. Something like recognition passed across her features, but she said nothing more. Mason gathered some blankets from the trunk and arranged them near the stove. "You can sleep here. I'll take the bed." Under normal circumstances, he would have given a guest the bed, but the Remington hanging on the wall above it provided a measure of security. He wasn't ready to surrender. Not with bounty hunters potentially tracking his unexpected visitor. Sina nodded, then spoke again, her voice softer than before. "Thank you." Mason acknowledged her gratitude with a slight incline of his head, then moved to secure the cabin for the night. He added wood to the stove, checked that the door was bolted, and finally took down the Remington, examining the loading before setting it beside his bed. Throughout these preparations, he felt Sina's eyes following him, assessing his routines, perhaps looking for weaknesses. When he finally lay down, he didn't expect sleep to come easily. Yet the long day and the emotional toll of losing and regaining Storm had left him drained. His last conscious thought before drifting off was that, for the first time in 3 years, he wasn't alone in the cabin. He wasn't sure if that was a comfort or a threat. The nightmare returned, but different this time. Mason stood again at the edge of the Apache village, watching as soldiers torched dwellings and dragged screaming people into the open. But now, instead of the anonymous woman with a child, he saw Sina running past him, her eyes wide with terror. Blackwood raised his pistol, and Mason lunged forward, grabbing his arm. The gun discharged the bullet, grazing Mason's neck. Blackwood's face contorted with rage, and he brought the butt of his pistol down against Mason's temple. As Mason fell to his knees, the world spinning, he saw Sina looking back at him, her eyes filled with accusation. "You didn't stop them. You didn't save us." But this time she spoke aloud, her voice clear, despite the chaos around them. "Why you wear this?" She reached toward him, touching something on his chest. Mason looked down to see the regimental insignia on his uniform, the same unit as Blackwood. "I'm not like him," Mason tried to say, but no sound emerged. Sina's face hardened. "All same, all kill." Mason jerked awake, the dream dissolving, but its emotional residue lingering. Pale morning light filtered through the cabin windows. He lay still for a moment, orienting himself, the weight of the Remington reassuring beside him. Then he remembered his visitor. He sat up quickly, scanning the cabin. The blankets near the stove were empty, neatly folded. The door stood slightly ajar, a strip of bright sunlight cutting across the wooden floor. Mason pulled on his boots and moved to the door, a sense of déjà vu washing over him. Would he find the corral empty again? Storm and the Apache woman both vanished like a strange dream. But when he stepped onto the porch, relief flooded through him at the sight of Storm in the corral, head lowered as he grazed on the small patch of grass that grew along the fence line. The gate was properly secured, the rope tied in the same knot Mason always used. Movement near the well caught his attention. Sina stood at the pump, working the handle with her good arm, filling a bucket with water. She had arranged her hair in a single braid down her back, and in the morning light, Mason could see details he'd missed the night before. She was older than he'd initially thought, perhaps in her early 30s, rather than her 20s, with lines at the corners of her eyes that spoke of a hard life. Her deerskin dress, though torn at the shoulder, was beautifully crafted, adorned with beadwork in geometric patterns of blue and white. She looked up as he descended the porch steps, her expression unreadable. "Morning," Mason said, approaching slowly. Sina nodded in acknowledgement, then gestured to the bucket. "Water." "Yes, thank you." He took the handle of the now full bucket from her, noting how she favored her injured arm. "How's the shoulder?" She touched the bandage lightly. "Good." Then she glanced toward Storm. "Horse good, too." Mason followed her gaze. Storm did look better this morning. The exhaustion of the previous evening replaced by a calm alertness. The horse raised his head, regarding them both, with what Mason could have sworn was satisfaction. "He's never done that before," Mason said. "Left and brought someone back." Sina studied the horse thoughtfully. "He know. Smart horse." "Know what?" Instead of answering, Sina turned her attention to the cabin. "You alone. No woman, children." The question caught Mason off guard. "No, just me." She nodded as if confirming something she'd already suspected. "Long time alone. 3 years." Mason found himself unexpectedly willing to share this small piece of his history. "Since my wife died." A flicker of something recognition, perhaps, or sympathy crossed Sina's face. "Sorry." Mason carried the water bucket toward the cabin, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "I'll make breakfast." Inside, he busied himself with rebuilding the fire in the stove and preparing a simple meal of cornmeal mush with the last of the honey he'd traded for in town. As he worked, he was acutely aware of Sina moving around the cabin, her bare feet nearly silent on the wooden floor. She paused at the small shelf where he kept his few books, running a finger along their spines, then moved to the window that faced east, looking out toward the hills where Storm had found her. "They follow," she said suddenly. Mason looked up from the stove. "Who the hunters?" Sina nodded, her expression grim. "2 men. Track good." The information sent a chill through Mason. "How far behind?" "1 day. Maybe less now." She turned to face him fully. "I go soon. Not bring trouble to you." Mason considered this. The logical response would be to agree to send her on her way and distance himself from whatever conflict had led armed men to pursue an Apache woman through the territory. But the thought of turning her out injured and alone sat uneasily with him. Before he could respond, a strange sound came from outside, a low whistle that rose and fell like a bird call, but wasn't quite natural. Sina's head snapped toward the window, her body tensing. "What is it?" Mason asked, reaching for the Remington. "Apache?" she whispered. "My people." Mason moved to the window, peering out cautiously. At first he saw nothing unusual, just the yard and the corral beyond. Then a slight movement caught his eye, a figure crouched low beside the water trough, partially hidden by its wooden sides. Another Apache, a man this time dressed for traveling with a bow slung across his back. "Friend?" Mason asked, keeping his voice low. Sina had moved to his side, looking out through the glass. "Brother, Nakohe." Mason glanced at her, surprised. "Your brother is tracking you too." She shook her head. "Not track me. Track men who hunt me." The complexity of the situation was growing by the minute. Mason weighed his options, the Remington heavy in his hands. The smart play would be to stay uninvolved, to send Sina out to her brother and let them deal with their own troubles. But something held him back. Perhaps the memory of Blackwood's cruelty, or the accusation in Dream Sina's eyes. "You didn't stop them." "Bring him in," Mason decided, setting the rifle aside in a deliberate gesture of trust. "Both of you can rest here before moving on." Hina searched his face, perhaps looking for signs of deception. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded once, then moved to the door. She stepped onto the porch and made the same whistling call they'd heard moments before. After a brief pause, the man rose from his hiding place and approached the cabin with the cautious grace of a deer entering a clearing. Mason stood in the doorway, hands visible to show he was unarmed. The Apache man stopped at the foot of the porch steps, his dark eyes moving from Sina to Mason and back again. He was younger than Sina, perhaps, in his mid-20s, with the lean, hard-muscled build of someone accustomed to covering long distances on foot. A recent scar crossed his left cheek, still pink against his copper skin. Sina spoke to him rapidly in Apache, gesturing toward Mason and then to her bandaged shoulder. The man's expression remained neutral, but his posture relaxed slightly. He addressed Mason directly in surprisingly good English. "You helped my sister. Thank you." Mason nodded acknowledgement. "She needed it." "I am Nakohe." The man touched his chest, then gestured toward the hills. "Two men follow. Bad men. Blackwood and his dog." Mason felt as though the ground had dropped from beneath his feet. "Blackwood," he repeated, his voice hollow. "Roland Blackwood." Nakohe's eyes narrowed. "You know this man." The nightmare flashed through Mason's mind. Blackwood standing over the dying soldier. Blackwood ordering the attack on the village. Blackwood raising his pistol as the woman ran with her child. "I knew him during the war." Mason's hand moved unconsciously to the scar on his neck. "We were not friends." Sina was watching him intently, her eyes moving between his face and the scar he was touching. "He hurt you?" Mason nodded slowly. "Yes, a long time ago." The siblings exchanged a look that contained volumes of unspoken communication. Whatever conclusion they reached remained private, but Nakohe seemed to come to a decision. "We go now," he said. "Men are close. Not safe for you if we stay." Mason found himself reluctant to let them leave, though he couldn't have explained why. Perhaps it was the mention of Blackwood, or the way Storm had deliberately brought Sina to him, as if the horse somehow knew they were connected by the shadow of a shared enemy. "Wait," he said. "You need supplies, food, water." He hesitated, then added, "And Sina's shoulder needs more time to heal." Nakohe looked skeptical. "Why you help white men, not help Apache?" It was a fair question, one Mason wasn't sure he could answer. Instead, he said simply, "Not all white men are the same, just as not all Apache are the same." The young man considered this, then spoke quickly to Sina in their language. She replied, gesturing toward Storm, who was watching the exchange from the corral with unusual attentiveness. Finally, Nakohe nodded. "We stay until dark. Then we go." Mason accepted this compromise. "Come in. There's food." They followed him into the cabin, Nakohe moving with the silent watchfulness of a man accustomed to danger. Mason served the cornmeal mush he'd prepared, adding the last of his dried apples to make the plain fare more appealing. The siblings ate with the controlled hunger of people who knew the value of food when on the run. As they ate, Nakohe explained their situation in terse sentences between bites. Blackwood hunt Apache now, not soldier anymore. Bounty hunter. His face hardened. Takes women, sells them south. Men who fight, he kills. The revelation didn't surprise Mason. Blackwood had always been cruel, more interested in power than in honor or duty. The war had merely given him license to indulge his worst impulses. 2 days ago he come to our camp, Nakohe continued. Take 3 women. Sina fight. Kill Blackwood's man. We run. Sina looked up from her food, her dark eyes meeting Mason's. I not sorry. Bad man. Try to... She made a gesture that needed no translation. You defended yourself, Mason said. No one can fault you for that. But the territorial authorities wouldn't see it that way. An Apache woman killing a white man, even in self-defense, would find no justice in any court. The best they could hope for was to outrun Blackwood and disappear into the more remote regions where some Apache bands still lived freely. How did you end up alone? Mason asked Sina. Where are the other women? Sina and Nakohe exchanged another look. It was the brother who answered. We separate. Harder to track. Others go north with our cousin. We go east, then south. And Storm found you. Mason still couldn't quite believe his horse had deliberately sought out Sina. Sina nodded. I hide in rocks. Leg hurt. Horse come stand quiet. Like he wait for me. She paused, searching for words. I know this horse. From before. Mason frowned. Before? Blackwood steal horses too, Nakohe explained. 3 summers ago. Storm was Apache horse, from our herd. The revelation struck Mason like a physical blow. Storm, his loyal companion for 3 years, had originally been stolen from Sina's people. The horse he'd purchased legitimately, or so he thought, from a cavalry officer mustering out, had been taken in one of Blackwood's raids. I didn't know, Mason said, the food suddenly tasteless in his mouth. I bought him after the war, from a cavalry officer. Sina shook her head. Not blame you. Horse choose now. Choose both. The idea that Storm had recognized Sina's scent or somehow known she belonged to the people who had raised him seemed fantastical. Yet, how else could Mason explain the horse's unprecedented behavior? Outside, the sun had climbed higher, morning, giving way to a clear autumn day. Mason moved to the window, scanning the horizon with newfound wariness. If Blackwood was truly tracking the siblings, it wouldn't take him long to reach the cabin. The rain 2 nights ago would have slowed him, but an experienced tracker would eventually find the trail. We need to prepare, Mason said, turning back to his guests. If Blackwood is coming, we should be ready. Nakohe raised an eyebrow. He's my enemy too. Mason touched the scar on his neck again, the memory of Blackwood's betrayal sharp, even after all these years. And this is my land. I have the right to defend it. The siblings exchanged another look, communicating silently in the way that only family could. Finally, Nakohe gave a small nod of acceptance. What you think, fight or run? It was a question Mason had faced before during the war and after when he'd fled Texas with Sarah's ghost at his heels. Fighting meant blood and risk. Running meant leaving behind the small life he'd built here, the only place he'd found any measure of peace since burying his wife. We prepare to fight, he decided, but we keep running as an option. For the first time, a hint of approval showed in Nakohe's eyes. Wise, like Apache. They spent the next hours preparing the cabin for a possible confrontation. Mason had lived through enough battles to know the value of good defensive positions. He moved the table to block the front window, leaving just enough space to shoot through. The trunk went against the back door, which was rarely used. He distributed his weapons, the Remington rifle, to Nakohe, who proved to be familiar with firearms, and a Colt revolver for himself. Sina, despite her injured shoulder, insisted on taking the old shotgun Mason kept for hunting. While Mason and Nakohe worked on fortifying the cabin, Sina moved around the small space, examining everything with curious intensity. She paused at the shelf, where Mason kept his few books, running her fingers over the spines as she had earlier. "You read?" she asked. Mason nodded, surprised by the question. "Yes? Read words to me." The request was unexpected, but Mason obliged, taking down a volume of Thoreau he'd carried since his days at a Pennsylvania boarding school. He opened to a random page and read aloud, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not when I came to die, discover that I had not lived." Sina listened intently, her head tilted slightly. When he finished, she nodded as if the words had confirmed something for her. "Good words," she said. "Live deliberate. Not die without living." Mason looked at the book with new appreciation. He'd read the passage countless times, but hearing Sina's interpretation gave it fresh meaning. As the day progressed, a strange sense of camaraderie developed among the three of them. They were unlikely allies. A former Union soldier haunted by his past, an Apache woman fighting for her freedom, and her brother bent on protecting what remained of their family. Yet there was a shared purpose in their preparations, a common enemy in Blackwood. By mid-afternoon, the cabin was as secure as they could make it, with limited resources. Mason surveyed their work with grim satisfaction. If Blackwood came, he wouldn't find easy prey. "Now we wait," Nakohe said, settling by the front window with the Remington across his knees. Waiting was familiar territory for Mason. He'd spent countless hours in trenches and behind barricades during the war, the anticipation of battle often worse than the fighting itself. Now as then, he kept his hands busy to control the nervous energy. He cleaned and oiled the Colt, checked and rechecked their ammunition, and finally set to preparing a meal from their dwindling supplies. Sina helped moving around the small kitchen area with efficient grace, despite her injury. She added pinches of herbs Mason didn't recognize to the pot of beans he was reheating the scent, transforming the simple fare into something more appetizing. When he raised an eyebrow in question, she simply said, "Apache cooking better." The domesticity of the moment struck Mason as surreal. For 3 years, he had lived alone, his days marked by solitary routines. Now his cabin was filled with movement and the low murmur of Sina and Nakohe occasionally speaking in their language. It should have felt like an intrusion, yet somehow it didn't. Instead, it felt like the cabin was finally serving its true purpose, sheltering people, not just a man and his ghosts. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the yard, Nakohe straightened at his post by the window. "Rider," he said, his voice tense, "coming from the east." Mason moved quickly to the window, peering through the narrow space they'd left for observation. A lone figure on horseback approached across the open ground, still too distant to identify clearly. "Just one?" Mason asked, frowning. "Blackwood travels with at least one man, you said." Nakohe nodded, eyes narrowed. "Other could be circling behind." It was standard military tactics, one man to draw attention while another approached from the rear. Mason had used the strategy himself during the war. "Sina, watch the back," he instructed, gesturing toward the small window on the opposite wall. "Nakohe, keep the rifle on our visitor. I'll go out and meet him." Both siblings looked at him with surprise. "You go outside?" Nakohe asked skeptically. "Could be shot." Mason checked the loading of his Colt. If it's Blackwood, he'll want to talk first. He always did like the sound of his own voice. He tucked the pistol into his belt, partially hidden by his coat. And I want to see his face when he recognizes me. It was a risk, but a calculated one. If Blackwood had tracked Sina and Nakohe to the cabin, confrontation was inevitable. Better to meet it on Mason's terms than to wait like trapped animals. "Be careful," Sina said, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that suggested more concern than the brief acquaintance warranted. Mason nodded and moved to the door. He stepped onto the porch just as the rider came close enough to identify a tall man with broad shoulders, a cavalry hat pulled low over his eyes, and a beard that hadn't been there during the war. But Mason would have recognized Roland Blackwood anywhere. Blackwood reined in his horse about 20 yards from the cabin, his right hand resting casually near the holster on his hip. He studied Mason for a long moment, a flicker of confusion crossing his features before recognition dawned. "Well, I'll be damned," Blackwood said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Mason Coleman, thought you'd died in Texas." "Sorry to disappoint," Mason replied, keeping his stance relaxed, despite the tension coiling in his gut. "What brings you to my property, Blackwood?" Blackwood's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just passing through, tracking some Apache renegades. Man and a woman killed one of my associates." He glanced around the yard, his gaze lingering on the corral where Storm watched warily. "Nice horse. Looks familiar." "He should. You stole him from the Apache before selling him to the cavalry." Blackwood's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Business is business, Coleman. Speaking of which, those Indians I'm tracking, you seen anything of them? There's a bounty. I'd be willing to split it for old times' sake." The casual cruelty of the man never ceased to amaze Mason. "Old times' sake," he repeated, his hand drifting closer to the Colt. "The last time we met, you tried to kill me for interfering with your idea of pacifying hostiles." Blackwood shrugged. "War makes men do extreme things. It's behind us now." His eyes hardened. "But my question stands. The Apache passed this way. My tracker found sign before I sent him around to approach from the west." So there was a second man, just as Nakohe had suspected. Mason kept his expression neutral, though inwardly he cursed. They were surrounded. "Haven't seen any Apache," he lied smoothly. "Just me and the horse here. You're welcome to water your mount and move on." Blackwood studied him for a long moment, skepticism clear in his weathered face. "You know, Coleman, you always were a poor liar, even back in the regiment." He leaned forward in the saddle. "I know they're here. The woman killed my man. The territory's offering $50 for her dead or alive. I intend to collect." Mason didn't bother denying it further. "And the other women? The ones you took from their camp. What bounty are you collecting for them?" A cold smile spread across Blackwood's face. "That's private enterprise. There are men in Mexico who pay well for exotic companionship, especially those who don't speak enough English to complain to authorities." He straightened in the saddle. "Now I'm going to ask you one more time as a courtesy to a former comrade in arms. Send out the Apache, and you can go back to your peaceful little life here." Mason felt a familiar calm settle over him, the same detached clarity he'd experienced in battle. "They're under my protection, Blackwood. You want them, you go through me." Blackwood sighed, as if disappointed, but not surprised. "Have it your way, Coleman." He raised his arm, making a sharp gesture toward the hills to the west. "Jenkins, light 'em up!" Mason barely had time to dive back through the cabin door before a shot rang out, splintering the wood where he'd been standing. Inside, Nakohe was already returning fire, the Remington cracking sharply as he aimed at Blackwood's retreating figure. "He has a man in the hills," Mason explained quickly, drawing the Colt. "They're trying to flush us out." Sina had positioned herself at the back window, the shotgun ready. "Man there too," she reported. "Coming closer." They were caught in a classic pincer movement, Blackwood and his second man closing in from opposite directions. The cabin, while defensible, was also a trap if the attackers decided to set it ablaze. As if reading his thoughts, Nakohe spoke grimly. "They will burn us out, like they did to our village." Mason's mind raced through options. They could try to hold out, hoping to wound or kill the attackers before the cabin was set on fire. They could attempt to escape out the back while Blackwood was still positioning himself at the front. Or they could split up, creating multiple targets and increasing the chances that at least some of them would survive. None of the choices were good. "We need to reach the horses," Mason decided. "Storm is in the corral, and your brother's mount must be nearby Sina. If we can get mounted, we have a better chance in open country than trapped here." Sina nodded, understanding the logic. "Nakohe horse in trees," she said, gesturing toward a small stand of juniper near the well. "Hidden." Another shot cracked against the cabin wall, this one punching through the thin wood near the roof. Blackwood was getting his range. "I'll draw their fire," Mason said, moving to the front window. "Nakohe, you and Sina make for the horses when I give the signal." Nakohe looked like he wanted to object, but after a quick exchange with Sina in Apache, he nodded. "What signal?" Mason checked the Colt one more time. "You'll know it when you hear it." Without further explanation, Mason moved to the back door, unblocking it just enough to slip through. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that provided some cover as he crept along the wall of the cabin toward the corner. From there, he could see Blackwood's position. The man had taken cover behind a large boulder, about 50 yards from the cabin's front, his rifle occasionally appearing as he took shots at the windows. Mason waited until Blackwood was reloading, then made his move. He stepped away from the cabin wall, raised the Colt, and fired 3 rapid shots at the boulder. The bullets ricocheted off the stone with sharp whines, forcing Blackwood to duck lower. "That the best you can do, Blackwood," Mason called, his voice carrying in the evening stillness. "Your aim was poor during the war, too. Maybe that's why you prefer unarmed women as targets." The taunt had its intended effect. Blackwood rose partially from behind his cover, anger overriding caution. "You sanctimonious bastard! You think you're better than me? We did what was necessary." Mason fired again, the bullet striking close enough to send rock fragments flying. Blackwood ducked back, cursing loudly. From the corner of his eye, Mason saw movement, Sina and Nakohe slipping out the back door, keeping low as they made their way toward the juniper stand. So far, Blackwood's second man hadn't spotted them, his attention likely focused on Mason's noisy distraction. "Necessary," Mason called back, keeping Blackwood's attention fixed on him. "Was it necessary to murder women and children, to sell people like cattle?" He fired again, deliberately wide this time, prolonging the distraction. "You're not a soldier, Blackwood. You're not even a man. You're just a rabid dog that should have been put down years ago." Blackwood's response was a volley of rifle fire that forced Mason to press flat against the cabin wall. The bullets splintered wood and shattered the front window, sending glass shards flying across the porch. In the momentary silence after the volley, Mason heard a sound that chilled his blood, a scream short and cut off from the direction of the corrals. Sina. He risked a glance around the corner of the cabin. Blackwood's second man, Jenkins, had emerged from his hiding place in the western hills and intercepted Sina as she approached the corral. He had her by the arm, her wounded shoulder twisting it cruelly as he dragged her toward Blackwood's position. Nakohe was nowhere to be seen. Mason didn't hesitate. He broke cover, the Colt raised, and fired at Jenkins. The distance was at the far edge of the pistol's effective range, and his shot went wide. Jenkins saw him and grinned, using Cena as a shield as he continued to drag her forward. "Got your Apache whore, Blackwood," Jenkins called. The brother ran off like a coward. Mason felt rather than saw Blackwood emerging from behind the boulder, rifle raised. He was caught in the open, an easy target. Time seemed to slow his mind, calculating angles and distances with the clarity that came only in life-or-death moments. He could try to rush Jenkins' attempt to free Cena, but Blackwood would cut him down before he made it halfway. He could retreat to the cabin, but that would mean abandoning Cena to whatever fate Blackwood had planned, a fate worse than death based on what Nakohe had told them. Or he could stand his ground and hope that his aim was better than Blackwood's. Before he could decide, a new sound cut through the evening air, a war cry high and fierce, followed by the thunder of hooves. Storm had broken free of the corral and was charging toward Jenkins and Cena, with Nakohe clinging to the horse's back, a knife gleaming in his raised hand. The distraction was all Mason needed. He sprinted forward, closing the distance to Jenkins, who had released Cena to fumble for his weapon. Mason tackled the man before he could draw the momentum, carrying them both to the ground. They rolled in the dust, grappling for control of the Colt that Mason still clutched. Nearby, he was vaguely aware of Nakohe, leaping from Storm's back to engage Blackwood, the two men locked in their own desperate struggle. Cena had disappeared from his line of sight. Jenkins was stronger than he looked, his trail-hardened muscles straining as he tried to wrestle the Colt from Mason's grip. They rolled again, and Jenkins landed on top his knee, pressing into Mason's chest, forcing the air from his lungs. The man grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth, as he gradually bent Mason's wrist back, the Colt inching toward Mason's own face. "You should have minded your own business, mister," Jenkins growled. "Now you get to die for some Apache whore." The slur ignited a rage in Mason that burned through his exhaustion. With a surge of strength, he bucked upward, throwing Jenkins off balance. The Colt discharged the bullet, grazing Jenkins's thigh. The man howled in pain and rolled away, clutching at the wound. Mason scrambled to his feet, searching for Blackwood and Nakohe. He found them near the boulder where Blackwood had taken cover earlier, locked in a desperate knife fight. Nakohe was quick and skilled, but Blackwood had the advantages of size and reach. As Mason watched, Blackwood landed a heavy blow that sent Nakohe stumbling backward. "Nakohe!" Mason shouted, raising the Colt. Blackwood turned at the sound, his eyes finding Mason. For a moment, they stared at each other across the yard, the setting sun casting long shadows between them. Then Blackwood's face twisted into a sneer, and he raised his own pistol, a move Mason had anticipated since the moment he recognized his old enemy. They fired simultaneously. Mason felt a searing pain across his right side as Blackwood's bullet grazed his ribs. His own shot was more accurate, striking Blackwood high in the chest. The man staggered backward, surprise replacing the sneer on his weathered face. He looked down at the spreading stain on his shirt, then back at Mason. "You always were a self-righteous son of a bitch." Blackwood gasped, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. He took another step backward. Then his legs gave way, and he collapsed. Mason approached cautiously, the Colt still raised. Blackwood lay on his back, eyes fixed on the darkening sky, his breathing ragged and wet. The wound was mortal. Mason had seen enough dying men to know. "The war's over, Blackwood," Mason said quietly. "It's been over for a long time." Blackwood's eyes found his, a spark of the old hatred still burning in them. "It's never over," he wheezed. "Not for men like us. We just find new battlefields." A bloody smile stretched across his face. "See you in hell, Coleman." His eyes glazed over, the spark extinguished. Captain Roland Blackwood, once Mason's commanding officer and the architect of countless atrocities, was dead. Mason felt no triumph, no sense of justice, served only a hollow exhaustion that reached down to his bones. He turned away from the body, surveying the aftermath of the brief but violent confrontation. Jenkins was gone, having apparently dragged himself away during the final exchange between Mason and Blackwood. A trail of blood led toward the eastern hills, suggesting the man hadn't gotten far. Nakohe was sitting on the ground near the boulder, pressing a hand to a wound on his shoulder, his face tight with pain, but his eyes alert. Of Sina there was no sign. "Sina!" Mason called, a note of alarm entering his voice. "Sina!" "Here." The reply came from near the corral, where Storm stood watching the proceedings with unusual attentiveness. Sina emerged from behind the water trough, a rifle Blackwood's Mason realized clutched in her hands. She had positioned herself to cover Mason's blind spot, ready to shoot if either Blackwood or Jenkins had gained the upper hand. The realization that she had been protecting him, even as he thought he was protecting her, struck Mason with unexpected force. Sina approached slowly, her eyes moving from Blackwood's body to Mason's blood-stained shirt. "You hurt?" Mason pressed a hand to his side, wincing at the pain. "It's not deep, just a graze." She nodded, then moved past him to check on her brother. The siblings spoke briefly in Apache Nakohe, gesturing toward his wounded shoulder with a grimace that might have been an attempt at a reassuring smile. Mason looked back at Blackwood's body, feeling the weight of the past pressing down on him. The man who had haunted his nightmares for years was dead by his hand. It should have brought relief, closure to a chapter of his life, marked by guilt and regret. Instead, he felt only tired and strangely empty. Sina returned to his side, her expression grave. "Jenkins gone, but more will come, always more." She was right, of course. Blackwood might be dead, but the territorial authorities would investigate when he failed to return. They would find his body, and Mason would be charged with murder. No one would believe or care that it had been self-defense or that Blackwood had been engaged in human trafficking. All they would see was a white man killed over Apache fugitives. "We need to go," Mason said, making the decision even as he spoke. "All of us. Tonight." Sina tilted her head, studying him with those intense eyes. "You leave home for us." Mason looked at the cabin, the small, solitary life he had built after Sarah's death. It had been a sanctuary of sorts, a place to lick his wounds and hide from the world. But it had also been a prison of his own making, walls built not just of wood, but of grief and guilt. "It hasn't been home for a long time," he admitted, "just a place to wait." Understanding dawned in Sina's eyes. "Wait for what?" Mason didn't have an answer, at least not one he could put into words. He had been waiting for something to change, for the hollow feeling inside him to fade, for some sign that he was allowed to live again after failing to be there when Sarah needed him most. Instead of responding, he turned toward the corral where Storm was watching them. The horse that had once belonged to Sina's people, stolen by Blackwood, purchased innocently by Mason, and now in some strange convergence of fate had brought them all together. "Storm found you for a reason," Mason said finally. "I think maybe it's time I found out what that reason is." Sina nodded, a small smile touching her lips for the first time since she had arrived. "Apache believe horse carries spirit messages. Maybe Storm carry message for both of us." It was a fanciful notion, the kind that Mason's rational mind would normally dismiss. Yet after everything that had happened, he found himself willing to consider it. Perhaps there was meaning in their unlikely meeting, something beyond coincidence or chance. "We'll need to move quickly," he said, returning to practicalities. "Gather what supplies we can carry. I'll see to the horses." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Mason Coleman prepared to leave the solitary existence he had maintained for 3 years. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the company of two people who had been strangers just a day before. Behind lay a dead man and the ghosts of the past. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt something stir inside him, not happiness, not yet, but perhaps its distant cousin hope. Storm snorted softly as Mason approached, as if approving his decision. Mason ran a hand down the horse's neck, the same gesture he had made countless times over the years, but now with a new understanding of the bond between them. "Let's go find your people," he murmured. "And maybe mine, too." The night closed around them as they prepared for a journey none had anticipated, but all now embraced. Somewhere to the west, where the Apache still lived free, lay the possibility of a different life, one not defined by loss and solitude, but by connection and perhaps redemption. I've completed the first part of your story, 7,000 words, following your enhanced outline. This section introduces Mason Coleman, his traumatic past with Blackwood, and his unexpected meeting with Sina when his horse Storm brings her to his cabin. It builds the relationship between these characters while incorporating the psychological depth twists and emotional moments from your outline. The writing style is cinematic and emotional with measured pacing that allows for both action and introspective moments. I've maintained the slow burn approach while ensuring there are enough compelling elements to keep readers engaged. Would you like me to continue with part 2 now? The next section would develop their journey, deepen their relationship, and build toward the final confrontation with Blackwood's associates. The desert night embraced them as they rode west, 3 silhouettes against a star-filled sky. Mason led the way on Storm, who moved with surprising energy despite the events of the past days. Nakohe followed on his paint gelding, his wounded shoulder bound tight with strips of cloth, torn from Mason's spare shirt. Sina rode behind her brother, her arms wrapped around his waist, her face occasionally turning to scan their back trail. They had left Blackwood's body where it fell. There'd been no time for burial, and truthfully, Mason felt no obligation to provide his former commander with that final dignity. Jenkins had vanished into the darkness, wounded but alive. A loose end that troubled Mason as they pushed farther from the cabin. The land changed as they traveled the sparse juniper and pinyon, giving way to rockier terrain. The moon rose, casting the landscape in silver and shadow, transforming familiar territory into something alien and mysterious. Mason had rarely ventured this far west of his property, preferring the isolation of his small valley to the uncertain welcome of the territories beyond. After several hours of hard riding, Nakohe called a halt beside a narrow stream that cut through a rocky ravine. The water gurgled softly over smooth stones, the sound a gentle counterpoint to the horse's labored breathing. "Rest here," Nakohe said, sliding carefully from his mount. "Water, good, hidden from eyes." Mason dismounted stiffly, the wound in his side pulling painfully. The initial shock had worn off during the ride, leaving a burning sensation that worsened with each movement. He'd bound it as best he could before leaving the cabin, but blood had soaked through the bandage, leaving a dark stain on his shirt. Sina noticed immediately. "Sit," she ordered, pointing to a flat rock near the stream. "Need clean." Too exhausted to argue, Mason complied. He watched as she efficiently collected water in a small tin cup they'd brought from the cabin, then removed several small pouches from a leather bag tied to Nakohe's saddle. She mixed the contents of one pouch with the water, creating a paste that gave off a sharp medicinal scent. "Off," she said, tugging at his blood-stained shirt. Mason hesitated, then carefully peeled the garment away from his wound, wincing as the dried blood pulled at the raw flesh. Sina knelt beside him, her face impassive as she examined the injury. The bullet had carved a furrow along his ribs deep enough to bleed freely, but not life-threatening. "Lucky," she pronounced. "No bullet inside." She began cleaning the wound with water, her touch unexpectedly gentle. Mason watched her face as she worked, noting the concentration in her eyes, the slight furrow between her brows. In the moonlight, the planes of her face were sculpted in silver and shadow, revealing a beauty he hadn't fully appreciated before. "You've done this before," he observed. Sina nodded without looking up. "I am healer. For my people." The information added a new dimension to her character. Not just a woman fleeing violence, but someone with a defined role and skills within her community. A healer, someone who preserved life rather than taking it as he had done during the war. "That why Blackwood wanted you especially?" Mason asked. "Because you're a healer." A shadow crossed her face. "Partly. Healers know stories, songs, medicine ways. Blackwood think I know where people hide." She applied the herbal paste to his wound, the mixture burning briefly before a numbing coolness spread through the injured flesh. "Also, I fight back. Men like Blackwood not like when women fight." Mason could imagine it all too clearly. Sina refusing to submit, refusing to betray her people, fighting with the same quiet intensity she brought to everything. No wonder Blackwood had pursued her so relentlessly. "Your brother said Blackwood's been hunting Apache for years, taking women south." The thought sickened him. "How long has this been happening?" "Since war end," Sina replied, beginning to wrap clean bandages around his torso. "Army put many Apache on reservation. Bad place, no food, no medicine. Some people run away, hide in mountains." She tied off the bandage with practiced efficiency. "Blackwood find runners, kill men, take women, children. And the territorial authorities do nothing." A bitter smile touched her lips. Who listened to Apache white law for white people? The truth of her words stung. Mason had seen enough during and after the war to know that justice was rarely blind, especially when it came to the native peoples. The government's policies of forced relocation had created a situation ripe for exploitation by men like Blackwood men who saw opportunity in human suffering. Nakohe approached, carrying a handful of small, hard fruits he'd gathered from a nearby cactus. "Tuna," he explained, offering them to Mason. "Good for strength." Mason accepted the unexpected gesture of friendship. The fruit was sweet, with a slightly tart finish, the seeds requiring careful chewing. It wasn't much of a meal, but it took the edge off his hunger. As they ate in silence, Mason contemplated their situation. They were fugitives now, all three of them. Blackwood might have been operating outside the law with his human trafficking, but in the eyes of the territorial authorities, Mason was still a white man who had killed another white man over Apache renegades. If caught, he'd hang alongside Sina and Nakohe. "Where are we heading?" he asked finally. The siblings exchanged one of their communicative glances. Nakohe answered, "West, then north. Mountains. Some free Apache there. Small band led by our cousin Nantai." "How far?" 3, maybe 4 days, if no trouble." Mason nodded, calculating. The supplies they'd hastily gathered from the cabin wouldn't last that long: a few pounds of beans, some coffee, a small sack of cornmeal. They'd need to hunt or find wild food sources along the way. "And they'll welcome me, a white man." Sina looked at him with those penetrating eyes. "You kill Blackwood. Help us escape." She paused. "But trust must be earned. Slowly." It was a fair assessment. Mason couldn't expect immediate acceptance from people who had suffered so much at the hands of white soldiers and settlers. Trust was indeed something to be earned, not assumed. "We should move soon," Nakohe said, looking at the lightening sky to the east. "Sleep little now. Ride before dawn." They settled as comfortably as possible in the shelter of the ravine, the horses ground-tied nearby. Nakoe took the first watch, his wounded shoulder apparently not diminishing his sense of responsibility. Sina curled up on her side near the remains of the small, nearly smokeless fire they'd built to ward off the night chill. Mason sat with his back against a boulder, the colt within easy reach, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, but his mind too active for sleep. The past 24 hours had transformed his life completely. Yesterday morning, he had been a solitary man living a solitary existence, his only company the ghost of his dead wife, and a horse with an unknown past. Now he was a fugitive, traveling with two Apache he barely knew toward an uncertain reception from others who had every reason to mistrust him. Yet despite the danger and discomfort, Mason felt more alive than he had in 3 years. The hollow emptiness that had become his constant companion since Sarah's death had receded, replaced by a sharp awareness of the present moment. The cool night air, the soft breathing of his companions, the distant cry of a coyote hunting in the darkness. As his eyes drifted closed, Mason's hand moved to the inner pocket of his coat, seeking the familiar comfort of Sarah's letter. His fingers touched the worn paper, tracing the creases made by countless unfoldings and refoldings. He'd carried her final words like a talisman, a connection to the life and love he'd lost. "I'm waiting for you to come home, my love." For the first time, the words didn't bring the usual stab of guilt and regret. Instead, Mason found himself wondering what Sarah would think of his current situation. She had been a woman of strong convictions with a sense of justice that had sometimes put her at odds with the conventional thinking of her time. Would she approve of his choice to help Sina and Nakohe, to stand against Blackwood's cruelty? He liked to think she would. With that comforting thought, Mason surrendered to sleep his dreams for once, unmarred by battlefields or accusations. Dawn came too quickly, a pale glow seeping into the eastern sky. Mason woke to Sina's hand on his shoulder, her touch, light but insistent. For a moment, still caught in the haze between sleep and wakefulness, he thought it was Sarah rousing him for an early start to the day. The momentary confusion gave way to a sharp pang of loss, followed by the reality of their situation. "We go," Sina said simply, already moving to help her brother with the horses. Mason rose stiffly, his side aching despite Sina's herbal treatment. He checked the wound carefully, finding it less inflamed than he'd expected. Whatever medicine she had applied was effective, another indication of her skill as a healer. They ate a cold breakfast of cornmeal cakes prepared the night before, washing it down with water from the stream. The meal was simple but sustaining fuel for the journey ahead. As they ate, Nakohe outlined their route. "Stay away from settlements. Follow old trails through mountains." He traced a path in the dirt with a stick. "Cross Big River tomorrow. Then 2 days to Nantai's camp." Mason studied the crude map, committing it to memory. The route would be challenging, rugged terrain, limited water sources, the constant threat of discovery. But it was their best chance for survival. "What about Jenkins?" he asked. "He's still out there, wounded but alive." Nakohe's expression hardened. "If we find him, he dies." Mason couldn't argue with the sentiment. Jenkins was as guilty as Blackwood had been, and a dangerous witness to what had transpired at the cabin. They mounted up and continued westward, as the sun rose behind them, casting long shadows across the rocky landscape. The day promised to be hot, the autumn coolness giving way to a late-season heat that shimmered above the distant ridges. They kept to ravines and draws, where possible, avoiding the exposed ridgelines where their silhouettes might be spotted by distant observers. Storm moved with steady confidence, as if he recognized the terrain. Perhaps he did. Mason reflected. If the horse had indeed belonged to Sina's people before being captured by Blackwood, he might be traveling familiar paths, returning to lands he had known in his youth. The thought brought an unexpected lump to Mason's throat, the idea of the horse finding his way home after years of separation. By midday, the heat had become oppressive. They stopped in the shade of a sandstone outcropping, allowing the horses to rest, while they conserved their limited water supply. Sina wandered a short distance away, returning with a handful of small desert plants that she crushed between her fingers, releasing moisture that she applied to her lips. "Desert apple," she explained, offering some to Mason. "Water inside." The plant provided little actual hydration, but the moisture was soothing to parched lips. Mason watched as Sina moved confidently through the sparse vegetation, identifying edible and medicinal plants with the ease of someone who had grown up learning the secrets of the land. Her relationship to this harsh environment was fundamentally different from his own. Where he saw challenge and scarcity, she saw resources and possibilities. "You know this area well," he observed. Sina nodded. "My mother's family hunt here. Long ago." A shadow passed across her face. "Before soldiers come." The simple statement contained volumes of unspoken history, displacement, violence, loss. Mason felt a familiar twinge of guilt, the burden of association with those who had perpetrated such injustices. Yet Sina's expression held no personal accusation, only a resigned acknowledgement of historical truth. As they prepared to continue their journey, a distant sound caught Mason's attention, the faint but unmistakable report of a rifle echoing off the canyon walls. All three froze, listening intently. The shot was not repeated, but its implication was clear. They were not alone in this seemingly empty wilderness. "Hunters," Mason suggested, though he knew better. Game was scarce in this arid region and recreational hunters rare. Nakohe shook his head grimly. "Pursuers. Maybe Jenkins found help." The possibility had been in the back of Mason's mind since their escape. Jenkins had been wounded, but not fatally. If he'd managed to reach a settlement or a military patrol, he could have reported Blackwood's death painting Mason as a murderer and Indian sympathizer. "How far was that shot?" Mason asked. Nakohe cocked his head, considering. 3 miles, maybe 4, south of us. That gives us some lead at least, but we should change direction, throw them off our trail." Sina pointed toward a rugged ridge to the northwest. "Old Apache trail there. Hard to follow unless you know way." The decision was made without further discussion. They mounted quickly and set off toward the ridge, pushing the horses harder than they would have preferred in the heat. The terrain grew increasingly difficult, the soil giving way to bare rock that held no tracks. They zigzagged up a narrow game trail, Storm picking his way carefully over the loose shale, the other horse following closely behind. At the top of the ridge they paused to let the animals catch their breath. The view was expansive, allowing them to see the terrain they had traversed since morning, a patchwork of ravines, mesas, and sparse vegetation stretching back toward the distant smudge on the horizon that marked the location of Mason's cabin. To the northwest, the land rose steadily toward the mountains that were their destination, their peaks hazy in the afternoon heat. Nakohe scanned the landscape with the focused attention of a trained scout, his eyes lingering on a distant dust cloud to the south. "Riders," he said finally. 5, maybe 6, following our old trail." Mason studied the dust cloud, unable to make out individual figures at this distance, but trusting Nakohe's sharper eyes. "Can they track us to here?" "Maybe. Depends if they have Indian tracker. White men not so good at reading sign." It was a small advantage, but they couldn't count on it being enough. They needed to keep moving to put as much distance as possible between themselves and their pursuers before nightfall. The old Apache trail proved to be little more than a suggestion of a path, visible only to Sina's experienced eye. It wound along the ridgeline before descending into a maze of small canyons doubling back on itself, in places crossing bare rock where no tracks would show. It was perfect for their purposes, difficult to follow unless you already knew the way. As they navigated the challenging terrain, Mason found himself increasingly impressed with Sina's knowledge. She led them unerringly through passages that looked impassable, identifying water sources that were invisible, until you were almost upon them, pointing out plants that could be gathered quickly for food or medicine. "Your people have used these trails for generations," Mason observed during a brief stop to water the horses at a hidden spring. Sina nodded. "Many generations. My grandmother's grandmother walked these paths." She ran her hand along the smooth rock beside the spring, where faint pictographs were barely visible beneath centuries of mineral deposits. "Our stories, written here." Mason studied the ancient markings, stylized human and animal figures, spirals and symbols whose meanings were lost to him. They spoke of a presence in this land that long predated American expansion westward, a history that had been systematically erased or ignored by those who saw the territory as empty and waiting to be claimed. "What do they say, the symbols?" Sina traced a spiral pattern with her finger. "This tells of water beneath earth. This," she pointed to a series of wavy lines, "speaks of dreams and spirit journeys." Her expression softened. "My father brought me here as child, taught me old ways, old words." "Your father is—" Mason left the question unfinished, uncertain how to ask about her parents' fate. "Dead," Sina said simply. "Soldiers. 5 winters ago." The stark response hung in the air between them. No elaboration was needed. It was a story repeated countless times throughout the territories, as the government's policy of containment and relocation was enforced with military precision. "I'm sorry," Mason said the words, feeling wholly inadequate. Sina looked at him with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see far more than he intended to reveal. "You were soldier," she said. It wasn't a question. Mason nodded, unable to deny it. "Yes, Union Army during the war between the states. Then, briefly before." He trailed off, unwilling to revisit the events that had led to his confrontation with Blackwood. "You fight Blackwood, then. Try to stop him." Her gaze didn't waver. "Why?" The question caught Mason off guard. He had never fully articulated, even to himself, why he had risked his military career and nearly his life to intervene in what his superiors had deemed a necessary pacification action. It had been an instinctive response to witnessing cruelty that crossed a line he hadn't even known he'd drawn until that moment. "Because it was wrong," he said finally. "What Blackwood ordered, attacking that village, killing civilians, it wasn't war. It was murder." He touched the scar on his neck unconsciously. "I couldn't stand by and watch it happen." Sina continued to study him, as if weighing the truth of his words against some internal measure. Finally she nodded, apparently satisfied. "Conscience," she said. "Rare thing in white soldier." The observation stung not because it was accusatory, but because it contained too much truth. Mason had seen enough during his service to know that conscience was often the first casualty of military life, sacrificed on the altar of obedience and expediency. Nakohe appeared from around a bend in the canyon, his expression urgent. "Need move. Herd horses back on trail. Getting closer." Their brief respite was over. They mounted quickly and continued along the hidden path. The sun now low in the western sky, casting long shadows that made the trail even harder to discern. Sina took the lead, her knowledge of the route becoming increasingly critical as daylight faded. They rode in tense silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Mason found his mind returning to Sina's question, why had he opposed Blackwood? The simple answer, because it was wrong, felt incomplete. There had been other injustices during the war, other cruelties he had witnessed or even participated in under orders. What had made that particular moment different? Perhaps it had been the culmination of too many compromises, too many justifications, accepted in the name of duty. Or perhaps, as Sarah had once suggested in one of her letters, he had been searching for a line he would not cross, a boundary that defined who he was beyond the uniform he wore. The thought of Sarah brought a familiar ache, but less sharp than before. He reached into his pocket, touching her letter, drawing comfort from its presence, even as he recognized that its hold on him was gradually loosening. As darkness fell, they were forced to make camp in a small box canyon that offered protection from the wind and concealment from anyone who might be searching for them. They risked no fire, sharing a cold meal of cornmeal cakes and dried beef from their dwindling supplies. The night was colder at this higher elevation, the stars brilliant in the clear desert sky. Nakohe took the first watch again, despite Mason's offer to start. The young Apache moved like a shadow to a position near the canyon entrance. The Remington cradled in his arms, his silhouette barely visible against the darker rocks. Mason settled against his saddle, the colt within easy reach, his body aching from the long day's ride. Beside him, Sina arranged her blanket, her movements efficient as she prepared for sleep. In the starlight, her face was a study in planes and angles, beautiful in its strength and determination. "Your wound," she said, gesturing to his side. "Need check." Mason nodded carefully, pulling up his shirt to expose the bandage. Sina leaned closer, her breath warm against his skin as she examined the binding. Her fingers were gentle but sure as she probed the edges of the wound through the cloth. "Healing good," she pronounced, "medicine working." "Thank you," Mason said, "for the care and for guiding us today. We wouldn't have made it this far without your knowledge." A small smile touched her lips, transforming her serious expression. Apache women know many things. Healing, finding way, making life in hard places. She settled back on her blanket. White men often not see this strength. "I see it," Mason said quietly. Their eyes met in the darkness, an unspoken understanding passing between them. They were from different worlds with histories that should have made them enemies. Yet, here they were, dependent on each other for survival, finding unexpected common ground in their shared journey. Sina spoke again, her voice softer than before. "You carry wife's memory, like heavy stone." Mason stiffened, surprised by the observation. "How did you know?" "See it in your eyes. In way you touch pocket where letter is." She looked up at the stars. "Apache believe spirits of dead watch from sky world. Not gone, just changed." The sentiment echoed beliefs Mason had heard expressed in various forms throughout his life, from the Christian heaven of his childhood to the more abstract concepts he'd encountered in books. He had never found much comfort in any of them. Sarah was gone, and no amount of spiritual philosophy could fill the void her absence had created. Yet something in Sina's simple statement resonated with him. The idea that Sarah might be watching not with judgment but with understanding offered a perspective he hadn't considered. "Do you believe that?" he asked. "That they watch over us?" Sina was quiet for a moment, her eyes still fixed on the star-filled sky. "Believe they see our journey. Hope we find good path." She turned to look at him. "Your wife would want you live, not just wait for death." The observation struck uncomfortably close to the truth. Mason had been waiting, though he'd never admitted it to himself in such stark terms. Not actively seeking death, but not fully engaged in life, either existing in a limbo of his own creation. "It's not easy," he said finally. "Moving forward." "No," Sina agreed. "Not easy, but necessary." She pulled her blanket closer around her shoulders. "Like crossing desert. Hard journey, but staying in one place means death." With that simple but profound observation, she closed her eyes, apparently ready for sleep, despite the danger that might still be pursuing them. Mason watched her for a moment, struck by the resilience that allowed her to find rest amid such uncertainty. His hand moved again to the pocket containing Sarah's letter fingers, tracing its familiar outline through the fabric. For 3 years he had carried it as both comfort and penance, a tangible reminder of what he had lost, and what he had failed to protect. Perhaps it was time to consider it differently, not as a weight anchoring him to the past, but as a compass pointing toward a future Sarah would have wanted for him. With that thought, Mason settled more comfortably against his saddle, allowing exhaustion to overcome the discomfort of his injuries and the hard ground beneath him. His last conscious awareness was of Storm standing guard near the canyon entrance, the horse's ears pricked forward alert to any approaching danger. Mason dreamed not of battlefields or accusations, but of Sarah standing in the doorway of their Texas home, sunlight streaming around her. She was smiling not with sadness or farewell, but with a kind of joyful expectation, as if waiting for him to notice something important. "You're still carrying my letter," she said, her voice as clear as if she stood beside him. "When will you read what it actually says?" Before he could respond, the dream shifted, and he was alone in an unfamiliar landscape, searching for something he couldn't name. In the distance, he saw a figure, Sina, walking steadily away from him, following a path he couldn't see. He called out to her, but his voice made no sound. She turned, looking back at him with those penetrating eyes, and held out her hand, waiting. He woke to Nakohe, shaking his shoulder, the young Apache's expression urgent in the pre-dawn light. "Riders coming," Nakohe whispered. "Many, with dogs." Mason was instantly alert, reaching for the colt as he sat up. Sina was already awake, rolling her blanket, with quick, efficient movements. The horses sensed the tension shifting nervously, Storm's ears flicking back and forth as he caught unfamiliar scents on the breeze. "How far?" Mason asked, keeping his voice low. "Not far. Maybe 1 hour behind." Nakohe pointed toward the canyon entrance. "They follow our trail from Water Place." It was what Mason had feared. Despite their precautions, their pursuers had managed to track them to the hidden spring and beyond. The old Apache trail hadn't been enough to throw them off the scent. "They have a good tracker," Mason observed grimly. Nakohe nodded. "Apache scout, working for white men." His expression conveyed what he thought of such betrayal. "Dogs make it worse. Can smell us." Mason had seen Army scouts use hounds to track fugitives during the war. The dogs were relentless, able to follow a scent trail for miles, undeterred by tricks that might fool human trackers. Once they had your scent, there was little hope of escape except by crossing water or reaching terrain too difficult for the animals to navigate. "The river," Mason said, remembering Nakohe's earlier description of their route. "How far is it?" "Half-day ride. Rough country between here and there." It was their best chance. If they could reach the river before their pursuers caught up, they might be able to cross and lose the dogs. But it would be a desperate race against time, with little margin for error. "Then we ride hard," Mason decided. "Save the horses for as long as we can, then push them if we have to." They broke camp quickly, leaving no sign of their presence except the inevitable scuffs and disturbances that couldn't be completely erased. Within minutes, they were on the move, Sina leading the way up a nearly invisible trail that switchbacked steeply out of the box canyon. As they climbed, Mason could see the wider landscape in the growing light, the rugged terrain they had traversed the day before, and in the far distance, a thin, dark line that might be the river they sought. Between their current position and that potential salvation lay miles of broken country, narrow canyons, rocky ridges, and sparse vegetation that offered little concealment. They pushed the horses as fast as the difficult terrain would allow, Sina guiding them along paths that sometimes seemed to disappear entirely before emerging again around a bend or over a rise. Her knowledge of the land was their greatest advantage, allowing them to take shortcuts that wouldn't appear on any military map. By mid-morning, the sun was beating down mercilessly, sapping their strength and making the horses' coats darken with sweat. They paused briefly at a seep, a place where groundwater emerged from between layers of rock to create a tiny, precious pool. The horses drank deeply, while the humans refilled their canteens, all three scanning the back trail for any sign of pursuit. "I don't see them," Mason said, squinting against the harsh light. "Maybe we've gained some ground." Nakohe shook his head, pointing to a distant ridge where a faint dust cloud was visible. "Still coming, moving fast." The brief respite was over. They mounted again and continued westward, the terrain gradually changing as they descended from the higher elevations. The bare rock gave way to sandy soil dotted with creosote bush and scattered boulders. It was more exposed than Mason liked, offering less concealment, but easier travel for the tired horses. "River soon," Sina assured them, pointing to where the land seemed to drop away in the distance. "Big canyon there. River at bottom." The news was encouraging, but Mason couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The exposed terrain made them visible for miles, and their pursuers seemed to be gaining ground despite their best efforts. He found himself constantly looking back, expecting to see riders appearing on the horizon at any moment. As they approached the canyon rim, a new sound reached them, the distant report of rifles followed by the whine of bullets passing overhead. Their pursuers had spotted them and were firing, though the distance was still too great for accurate shooting. "Ride!" Mason shouted, urging Storm into a gallop. They raced toward the canyon edge, the horses finding new energy in the urgency of their riders. Ahead, the land dropped away dramatically, revealing a steep switchbacking trail that descended hundreds of feet to the river below. The water gleamed in the midday sun, a ribbon of silver winding through the base of the massive canyon. At the rim, they reined in hard, the horses sliding to a stop on the loose gravel. The descent looked treacherous, a narrow path cut into the canyon wall, barely wide enough for a single horse with a sheer drop on one side. "We go down here?" Mason asked, eyeing the trail with concern. Sina nodded. "Only way to river for many miles. Pursuers must follow or ride far around." It was both their greatest danger and their best chance. The narrow trail would slow their pursuers and prevent the dogs from running ahead. But it also meant they would be exposed and vulnerable during the entire descent, unable to take cover if the men behind them decided to use their rifles. "I go first," Nakohe said, already turning his horse toward the trail. "Know the way. Sina follow. Mason last to watch back trail." It was a logical arrangement. Mason nodded, drawing the Colt in preparation for providing covering fire if needed. Nakohe started down the trail, his horse picking its way carefully over the loose stones. Sina followed, glancing back at Mason once with an unreadable expression before focusing on the treacherous path ahead. Mason waited until they had descended several switchbacks before starting down himself. Storm moved with surprising confidence on the narrow trail, as if he remembered it from some distant past. The horse's sure-footedness allowed Mason to divide his attention between the path ahead and the rim behind them, watching for the first appearance of their pursuers. They were halfway down when the riders appeared on the canyon rim, 6 men on horseback, with 2 dogs straining at leashes, held by a man Mason assumed must be the Apache scout. Even at this distance, he could see the glint of rifles and the distinctive uniform of at least 2 cavalry soldiers. The riders spotted them immediately, several raising their rifles. Mason turned in the saddle, the Colt steady in his hand, despite the precarious position, and fired twice. The range was extreme for a pistol, but his intent was to make them take cover rather than to hit anyone. It worked. The men fell back from the rim temporarily out of sight. "They're here," Mason called down to Sina and Nakohe. "We need to move faster." The descent became a nerve-wracking race against time, the horses scrambling down the switchbacks as quickly as they dared, loose rocks clattering down the canyon wall beneath their hooves. Mason kept glancing back, expecting to see the pursuers starting down the trail at any moment. But the rim remained empty, an unexpected reprieve that made him increasingly uneasy. They were nearing the bottom when Mason understood the reason for the delay. A single rider appeared on the rim dismounted and took a prone position with what appeared to be a long-range rifle. A marksman preparing to pick them off from above while they were exposed on the trail. "Sniper!" Mason shouted. "Get to cover!" Even as the warning left his lips, the rifle cracked, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. Mason felt the bullet pass close enough to stir the air near his head. Storm flinched, but held steady on the narrow path. Nakohe had reached the canyon floor and was urging his horse toward a cluster of boulders that offered some protection. Sina was still on the last switchback, exposed and vulnerable. As Mason watched in horror, the rifle fired again and Sina's horse reared, nearly sending her plummeting over the edge. She clung to the animal's mane, somehow maintaining her seat, as the horse came back to all fours, trembling violently. "Go!" Mason shouted to her. "I'll cover you!" He turned Storm sideways on the trail, making himself as small a target as possible while raising the Colt. The distance was extreme, but he had to try. He aimed carefully at the prone figure on the rim and fired 3 shots in rapid succession. He couldn't tell if he'd hit the marksman, but the man rolled back from the edge, temporarily removing the threat. Sina urged her frightened horse down the last stretch of trail, reaching the canyon floor and galloping toward the cover where Nakohe waited. Mason followed Storm, negotiating the final switchback with remarkable speed, his hooves barely touching the ground as he sensed the urgency of the situation. They regrouped behind the boulder cluster, momentarily safe from the sniper's line of sight. The river flowed about 50 yards away, its current swift but not impassable. On the far side, the canyon wall rose just as steeply, but without the switchbacking trail that had brought them down. It appeared to be a dead end. "Now what?" Mason asked, scanning the seemingly sheer cliff on the opposite bank. "We can't go up that way." Sina pointed downstream. "Follow river. Old path there, hidden." Her horse was still trembling, and Mason noticed blood on its flank, where the sniper's bullet had grazed it. The animal wouldn't last much longer at this pace. Nakohe was already remounting the Remington, ready in his hands. "Must cross quickly, before they all come down." Mason looked back at the trail they had descended. There was no sign yet of the other riders, but it wouldn't take them long to make the descent now that the 3 fugitives were pinned down. And the marksman on the rim could potentially pick them off as they crossed the exposed riverbed. "I'll go last," Mason decided. "Provide covering fire for you 2. Sina shook her head firmly. "Together, safer." There was no time to argue. The distant sound of hoofbeats on the trail told them their pursuers had started down. They mounted quickly and broke from cover, riding hard for the river's edge. Storm plunged in without hesitation, the water reaching his chest as he fought against the current. Nakohe's horse followed, struggling more in the swift flow. Sina's wounded mount balked at the water's edge, refusing to enter despite her urging. "Come on," Mason called, turning Storm back toward the bank. "Get on behind me." Sina abandoned her reluctant horse and waded into the shallows, reaching for Mason's extended hand. He pulled her up behind him onto Storm's back, feeling her arms wrapped tightly around his waist as the horse lunged forward into the deeper current. The river was stronger than it had appeared from the bank, its surface deceptively calm above a powerful flow. Storm fought valiantly, his powerful legs driving against the current, but the double burden slowed his progress. They were only halfway across when the first riders reached the canyon floor. "Hold tight," Mason told Sina, feeling her grip tighten in response. He turned in the saddle, the colt balanced carefully in one hand, while the other maintained his hold on Storm's mane. The distance was extreme for a pistol, but he had to try. He fired twice, forcing the riders to scatter for cover. On the far bank, Nakohe had already reached safety and was providing covering fire with the Remington, its longer range more effective at keeping their pursuers at bay. Between the two of them, they managed to hold off the riders long enough for Storm to reach the western shore, the horse dragging himself from the current with his last reserves of strength. "This way," Sina directed, pointing downstream, where the canyon wall seemed to recede slightly. They followed the riverbank for several hundred yards, the sounds of pursuit temporarily fading as their enemies dealt with the challenge of crossing the river. Around a bend, they discovered what Sina had promised, a narrow trail nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, ascending the canyon wall in a series of steep switchbacks. "Up there?" Mason asked, eyeing the precarious path dubiously. "Only way," Sina confirmed. They not know it, not on maps. It was their one advantage, local knowledge that their pursuers, even with an Apache scout, might not possess. The trail appeared to have been used by generations of native people, but remained unknown to government surveyors and military scouts. Nakohe started up first, his horse struggling with the steep incline after the exhausting river crossing. Mason dismounted, knowing that Storm couldn't carry both him and Sina up such a difficult trail. The horse was already at his limit, sides heaving, legs trembling with fatigue. "You ride," Mason told Sina. "I'll follow on foot." She started to protest, but Nakohe called down from higher up the trail. "No time. Riders crossing river now." Mason boosted Sina into the saddle, then slapped Storm's flank, sending him up the trail. The horse responded with one last surge of energy, following Nakohe's mount up the steep path. Mason began climbing on foot, his wounded side protesting with each step the colt held ready in case their pursuers discovered the hidden trail. The ascent was brutal, the path far steeper than it had appeared from below. Mason's boots slipped on loose stones, his hands grasping at roots and rock outcroppings to maintain balance. The wound in his side burned with renewed intensity, and he could feel fresh blood soaking through the bandage. But stopping wasn't an option, not with armed men at their backs, and Sina and Nakohe depending on him to follow. He was a third of the way up when he heard shouts from below. Their pursuers had reached the bend in the river and spotted the trail. Rifle fire erupted, bullets whining off rocks around him. Mason pressed himself against the canyon wall, momentarily sheltered by a slight outcropping. He risked a glance downward and saw 3 riders dismounting, preparing to follow on foot, while the others provided covering fire. From above, Nakohe's Remington responded, the shots carefully placed to force the riflemen to take cover. It bought Mason precious time to continue climbing, though each movement now threatened to expose him to fire from below. He was halfway up when he heard Sina call his name. Looking up, he saw her descending toward him using the steep path with surprising agility despite her earlier injury. "What are you doing?" he shouted. "Stay up there!" She ignored him, continuing until she reached his position. "You're bleeding," she said, pointing to the darkening stain on his shirt. "Need help?" Before he could protest further, she was at his side, sliding her shoulder under his arm, taking some of his weight. Her strength surprised him. She was smaller than him, but wiry and determined, her muscles hardened by a lifetime of physical work. "Together," she said, simply echoing her words from the riverbank. With Sina's help, Mason made faster progress up the trail, though the exertion was clearly taking a toll on both of them. Above, Nakohe continued to provide covering fire, the Remington's reports growing more spaced out as he conserved their limited ammunition. They were nearing the top when a bullet struck the rock face inches from Mason's head, showering them both with stone fragments. Sina stumbled momentarily, losing her grip on him, and Mason felt himself sliding backward on the loose stones. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought he would fall all the way to the canyon floor. Then Sina's hand closed around his wrist, her grip like iron, as she anchored herself against a boulder. "Hold on," she grunted, straining to maintain her position while pulling him back to safer ground. Mason regained his footing, his heart pounding with the nearness of disaster. "Thank you," he gasped, the words wholly inadequate for what she had just done. Sina didn't respond except to tighten her grip on his arm as they resumed their climb. The top of the canyon was tantalizingly close now, perhaps 30 more feet of precarious ascent. Behind and below them, their pursuers were making progress, though slowed by Nakohe's occasional shots and their unfamiliarity with the treacherous path. With a final exhausting effort, they crested the rim, collapsing onto level ground beside Nakohe, who continued to fire down at the climbing men. Storm stood nearby, his head hanging with fatigue, his sides still heaving from the exertion of the climb. "Can't stop," Nakohe said grimly, feeding his last cartridges into the Remington. "Need more distance." Mason knew he was right, though every muscle in his body screamed for rest. They had gained valuable time, but once their pursuers reached the top, the chase would resume. They needed to find more defensible ground, or somehow lose their trackers in the rugged landscape ahead. Sina helped Mason to his feet, her own exhaustion evident in the trembling of her hands, but her expression as determined as ever. "Forest ahead," she said, pointing to a line of darker green on the horizon. "Pines, good place to hide." Mason nodded, knowing they had no better option. He approached Storm, concerned about the horse's condition after the punishing climb. The animal raised its head as he neared, nickering softly in recognition. Despite his exhaustion, Storm's eyes were alert, his spirit unbroken. "One more push, old friend," Mason murmured, stroking the horse's lathered neck. "Then rest." He mounted carefully, wincing as the movement pulled at his wounded side, then reached down to help Sina up behind him. Her arms encircled his waist, again her body warm against his back as she held on. The simple human contact was both comforting and disturbing, comforting in its reminder that he wasn't alone in this struggle, disturbing in the way it awakened feelings he had thought long buried with Sarah. Nakohe fired a final shot down the canyon, then mounted his own exhausted horse. "Go now," he urged, "fast as can." They set off toward the distant tree line, the horses finding renewed energy in the relatively level ground. Behind them, the first of their pursuers appeared at the canyon rim, too far now for effective rifle fire, but a constant reminder of the danger at their backs. The landscape between the canyon and the forest was open but broken, dotted with arroyos and low ridges that provided some concealment as they rode. Sina directed them along a route that maximized these natural features, her knowledge of the terrain once again proving invaluable. By mid-afternoon, they had reached the first scattered pines, the beginnings of a forest that grew denser as the elevation increased. Among the trees, the temperature dropped noticeably, the harsh desert heat giving way to the cooler air of the mountain slopes. The pines grew larger and closer together as they climbed their trunks, providing welcome concealment from any observers behind them. The forest floor was carpeted with needles that muffled the sounds of the horses' hooves, another small advantage in their desperate flight. As daylight began to fade, they reached a small clearing beside a spring-fed stream. The horses were at the limits of their endurance, and Mason could feel Sina's grip around his waist weakening as her own strength waned. They had pushed themselves and their mounts to the breaking point in their escape from the canyon. "Stop here," Mason decided. "We all need rest, and the stream will cover our tracks. If they bring the dogs this far." Nakohe nodded wearily, dismounting with a grimace as his wounded shoulder protested the movement. "I make blind," he said, referring to a hunting technique of creating a camouflaged shelter. "Hide horses." They worked quickly, despite their exhaustion, constructing a simple lean-to of pine boughs and fallen logs that concealed them from casual observation. The horses were led deeper into the trees, where they could rest and graze on the sparse vegetation without being easily spotted. As darkness fell, they shared the last of their food, a handful of parched corn and some jerky that had survived the river crossing. It wasn't enough to satisfy their hunger after the day's exertions, but it would have to do until they could hunt or forage. "How far to your cousin's camp now?" Mason asked, sipping sparingly from his canteen. Nakohe considered his face gaunt with fatigue in the deepening twilight. "One day, maybe less. In mountains north of here." It was encouraging news. They were closer to safety than Mason had dared hope. But first, they had to evade the men who were still pursuing them, men who would not give up easily on their quest for revenge and bounty. "Will they follow us into the forest?" Mason wondered aloud. Sina, who had been examining his reopened wound, paused in her ministrations. "Some will, others afraid. Apache spirits in these mountains." A small grim smile touched her lips. "White men believe many things about forest. Most not true. Some are." The cryptic response sent a shiver down Mason's spine, despite the relative warmth of their shelter. He had heard stories during the war, soldiers speaking in hushed tones of Apache ambushes that seemed to materialize from nowhere, of warriors who could move through dense forest without disturbing a single leaf of sentries found dead without a sound to alert their comrades. "Let them believe," Nakohe said with quiet intensity. "Fear makes men stupid. Stupid men, easy to evade." Mason couldn't argue with the logic. Fear was a powerful deterrent, often more effective than physical barriers. If some of their pursuers were superstitious enough to fear the forest, it would work to the fugitive's advantage. As Sina finished rebinding his wound, which looked better than he'd expected, despite the day's exertions, Mason found himself studying her face in the fading light. The strength and determination he had noticed from the beginning were still there. But now he saw other qualities as well. Intelligence in the way she assessed their situation, compassion in her careful treatment of his injury, a quiet dignity that no amount of hardship seemed able to diminish. When she caught him watching her, Mason expected her to look away. Instead, she met his gaze steadily, her dark eyes reflecting the last of the daylight filtering through the pine boughs. Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of the bond that had formed through shared danger and mutual dependence. "Rest now," she said softly, her hand lingering briefly on his arm. "Long journey tomorrow." Mason nodded, settling back against the trunk of a pine, the Colt within easy reach. Nakohe had already stretched out on a bed of pine needles, his breathing deep and even in the exhausted sleep of a man who has pushed himself to his limits. Sina arranged her own resting place nearby, close enough that Mason could hear her breathing, but not so close as to suggest intimacy. As she settled, Mason found his hand moving once again to the inner pocket, where Sarah's letter rested. The paper felt different somehow, as if the river crossing had altered its texture, or perhaps it was his perception of it that had changed. He drew the letter out, holding it carefully in the last of the dying light. The paper was indeed damp from their passage through the river, the ink beginning to blur. In places, Sarah's neat handwriting becoming indistinct around the edges. The physical deterioration of this item he had treasured for so long should have distressed him, but instead he felt a strange sense of release, as if the river had washed away more than just the clarity of the ink. "I'm waiting for you to come home, my love." The line that had haunted him for 3 years took on a different meaning now. Perhaps Sarah hadn't been waiting for him to join her in death, as he had sometimes darkly imagined in his lowest moments. Perhaps she had been waiting for him to find a home again, not a physical place, but a state of being where he could live fully rather than merely exist. Mason carefully refolded the damp paper and returned it to his pocket. The gesture felt different this time, not the automatic, almost superstitious ritual it had become, but a deliberate act of remembrance and perhaps of beginning to let go. As sleep claimed him, Mason was again visited by dreams, but not the nightmares that had plagued him for years. Instead, he dreamed of Sarah standing in sunlight, smiling, as she watched him ride away not with sadness, but with a kind of benediction. And when he turned to look ahead, it was Sina he saw waiting on the path before him, her hand extended, her eyes reflecting not the past, but possibilities yet to be discovered. The dream faded as consciousness returned, replaced by the soft sounds of the forest, awakening to dawn. Mason opened his eyes to find Sina already up, moving quietly around their shelter, preparing for the day ahead. She had gathered some kind of root or bulb and was slicing it with a small knife, creating a pile of white flesh that she added to a tin cup of water. "Medicine?" Mason asked, his voice rough from sleep. Sina looked up, offering a small smile. "Food, wild onion, good for strength." The simple practicality of her response reminded Mason of how far they were from the comforts of civilization and how capable Sina was of finding sustenance where others would see only wilderness. It was a skill born of necessity and deep cultural knowledge, one that had kept her people alive in these lands for countless generations. Nakohe emerged from the forest, moving with the silent grace that still impressed Mason, despite their days of travel together. The young Apache carried several pine cones which he added to Sina's collection of foraged food. "Pine nuts," he explained, seeing Mason's questioning look. "Take time to get, but good food." They shared this simple breakfast, the sharp flavor of the wild onion and the rich nuttiness of the pine seeds providing a surprisingly satisfying meal. As they ate, Nakohe outlined their plan for the day. "Stay in forest. Follow ridgeline north." He pointed toward where the land rose more steeply beyond their clearing. "Cross old lava field by midday. Nantai's camp beyond in Hidden Valley." The mention of a lava field caught Mason's attention. "Will we leave tracks crossing it?" Nakohe shook his head. "Black rock holds no sign. Good place to lose followers." It was another piece of local knowledge that might save their lives, the understanding of which surfaces would reveal their passage and which would keep their secrets. Mason was increasingly aware of how much he had to learn about this land that he had thought he knew. They broke camp efficiently, leaving as little trace of their presence as possible. The horses had recovered somewhat overnight, though Storm still showed signs of the previous day's ordeal in the stiffness of his movements. Mason approached the gelding with concern, running his hands down the animal's legs, checking for any injuries that might have been overlooked in their hasty escape. "He is strong horse," Sina observed, coming to stand beside him. "Apache horse, made for mountains." Mason nodded, stroking Storm's neck affectionately. "He's saved my life more than once. Yesterday, most of all. Sina reached out to touch the horse as well, her fingers brushing against Mason's as they both caressed the animal. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through him, a sensation that had nothing to do with the morning sun filtering through the pines. "Horse knows good heart," Sina said softly. "Chooses rider with care." Before Mason could respond to this enigmatic statement, Nakohe approached, his expression urgent. "Must go. Heard dog bark. Far, but coming closer." The peaceful moment shattered, replaced by the familiar tension of pursuit. They mounted quickly, Sina again riding behind Mason on Storm, her arms encircling his waist, with what felt like more confidence than necessity. Nakohe led the way, following game trails that wound through the dense forest, gradually ascending toward the ridge he had indicated earlier. As they climbed, the character of the forest changed, the tall pines giving way to gnarled, wind-shaped specimens that clung to the increasingly rocky soil. The underbrush thinned, making travel easier, but offering less concealment. From time to time, gaps in the trees provided glimpses of the broader landscape. The river canyon they had crossed the day before, now a distant slash in the earth, and beyond it, the hazy outlines of the territory they had traversed in their flight from Mason's cabin. "Look," Sina said, suddenly pointing to a thin column of smoke rising from the forest below them. "They make camp, not follow into high country yet." Mason studied the smoke, estimating its distance. "That's at least a few hours behind us. We're gaining ground." Nakohe nodded satisfaction, evident in his usually stoic expression. "They afraid. Good." They continued along the ridgeline, the horses picking their way carefully over increasingly rocky terrain. By mid-morning, they had reached the edge of what Nakohe had called the lava field, a vast expanse of black rock twisted into fantastic shapes by its ancient cooling, stretching northward as far as Mason could see. It was a forbidding landscape, seemingly devoid of life, except for the occasional stunted pine that had somehow taken root in the inhospitable surface. "Cross here," Nakohe directed, turning his horse onto a faint trail that wound through the field of black stone. "Leave no track. Dogs lose scent on hot rock." It was a clever strategy. The black lava would heat quickly in the sun, dispersing any scent they might leave behind, while the hard surface would retain no hoof prints. If they could make it across this natural barrier, their chances of escaping their pursuers would increase significantly. The crossing proved challenging, the sharp edges of the lava threatening the horses' hooves, the heat reflecting back from the black surface, making the air shimmer around them. They were forced to move slowly, leading the horses on foot, for much of the way, picking out the smoothest path through the treacherous terrain. Halfway across, they paused in the shade of a large rock formation to rest and water the horses from their dwindling canteen supplies. The view from this elevated position was commanding, allowing them to see for miles in all directions. Behind them, the forested ridge they had traversed that morning stretched back toward the river canyon. Ahead, more mountains rose their slopes, densely wooded, their peaks occasionally crowned with bare rock. "Nantai's camp there," Nakohe said, pointing to a particular mountain whose summit was split into two distinct peaks. "Hidden valley on other side." "How many people in this camp?" Mason asked suddenly, conscious of the reception he might receive as a white man entering an Apache stronghold. "Small band, maybe 30-40 people." Nakohe's expression softened slightly. "Good people. Survived many hard times." Sina, who had been scanning the back trail with focused attention, spoke without turning around. "Riders at forest edge, looking at lava field." Mason moved to her side, squinting against the harsh light. In the distance, he could make out small figures at the boundary between the forest and the black rock expanse, their pursuers having followed them this far despite the challenges. As they watched, the figures seemed to be engaged in some sort of discussion or argument, gestures suggesting disagreement about how to proceed. "They're not sure about crossing," Mason observed, trying to decide whether to follow or go around. Nakohe studied the distant riders. "Going around takes many days. Too long if they want to catch us. But following means exposing themselves on open ground, where we could pick them off if we're waiting in ambush," Mason added, thinking like the soldier he had once been. A grim smile touched Sina's lips. "Apache stories say spirits live in black rocks, take unwelcome visitors." She glanced at Mason. "Not true, of course, but good story for keeping away those who don't belong." The blend of practical strategy and cultural mythology was characteristic of Sina's approach to survival, using every available tool, whether physical or psychological, to maintain her freedom and protect her people. Mason found himself admiring the effectiveness of this dual strategy, even as he recognized how it had been turned against the Apache by those who portrayed them as superstitious primitives rather than sophisticated survivors adapted to a harsh environment. After a brief rest, they continued their crossing of the lava field, moving with greater urgency now that they knew their pursuers were still on their trail. The black rock radiated heat as the sun climbed higher, making each breath feel like drawing fire into their lungs. By early afternoon, they had reached the northern edge of the field, where the lava gave way once more to soil capable of supporting more abundant vegetation. "Made it," Mason said with relief, helping Sina mount Storm again for the next stage of their journey. "Now we just need to reach your cousin's camp before nightfall." Nakohe, who had been studying their back trail, pointed to movement on the lava field. "3 follow. Others gone." Mason squinted against the sun, making out the distant figures crossing the black rock. Only half their original pursuers had chosen to continue the chase across the forbidding terrain. It was an advantage, but still a significant threat, especially since those who had persisted were likely the most determined and skilled. "We need to keep moving," Mason urged. "They'll cross faster than we did now that they can see the path we took." They pushed on, entering a forest of mixed pine and oak that climbed the slopes toward the twin-peaked mountain Nakohe had identified earlier. The terrain was steep, but less treacherous than the lava field, allowing them to make better time despite the uphill climb. Storm seemed to gain energy as they ascended, perhaps sensing they were nearing the end of their long journey. As they rode, Sina spoke quietly from behind Mason, her breath warm against his ear. "You afraid of my people?" The question caught him off guard. He considered it honestly before responding. "Cautious, yes. Afraid, I'm not sure." He paused. "I've seen what white men have done to the Apache. I understand if there's hatred." Sina was silent for a moment, as if weighing his response. "There is anger, much lost. But Nantai is wise leader, judges each person by own actions, not by color or tribe." Her arms tightened slightly around his waist. "You proved yourself. Helped us when didn't have to." The simple statement carried a weight of acceptance that Mason hadn't realized he'd been seeking. Over the past days he had come to respect and even care for Sina and Nakohe, but he had harbored doubts about whether he could ever truly bridge the gulf created by history and conflict. Sina's words offered a tentative hope that perhaps such bridges were possible, built one relationship at a time. As the afternoon waned, they entered a narrow canyon that cut between twin ridges extending from the split-peaked mountain. The passage was tight enough in places that they were forced to ride single file, the walls rising steeply on either side. Water trickled down one rock face, creating a lush microclimate of ferns and mosses that stood in stark contrast to the drier slopes they had traversed. "Almost there," Nakohe called back. "Valley beyond this passage." Mason felt Sina straighten behind him, her body tense with anticipation. How long had it been since she had seen her people, since she had been somewhere she could truly consider safe. The thought of providing her with that security after all she had endured filled him with a sense of accomplishment that outweighed any lingering concerns about his own reception. The canyon widened, suddenly opening into a hidden valley nestled between protective ridges. Aspen trees grew in dense stands along a clear stream that wound through the center of the valley, their leaves golden in the late afternoon light. Scattered among the trees were dwellings, some traditional wickiups made of brush and hides, others more substantial structures of logs and stone that suggested a semi-permanent settlement. Smoke rose from several cooking fires, and figures moved among the dwellings, women grinding corn, children playing, men working on weapons or tools. Dogs barked at their approach, alerting the camp to the presence of visitors. Nakohe raised his hand in greeting and called out in Apache. Immediately there was movement throughout the camp, people gathering to meet the newcomers. A tall man with graying hair stepped forward. His bearing dignified his face, weathered by years of sun and hardship. This Mason assumed must be Nantai, the cousin and leader Nakohe had spoken of. As they drew closer to the gathering crowd, Mason felt a momentary hesitation, an awareness of his status as an outsider entering a close-knit community. But Sina's presence behind him, her hand resting reassuringly on his shoulder, gave him the confidence to continue forward. They halted before the assembled group, and Nakohe dismounted, first approaching Nantai with a gesture of respect. The two men clasped forearms, then spoke rapidly in Apache. Nakohe, presumably explaining their journey and the circumstances that had brought them to the hidden valley. As they talked, Nantai's gaze shifted to Mason and Sina, still mounted on Storm. His expression remained impassive, but his eyes were keen and evaluating. When Nakohe finished speaking, Nantai approached them, looking up at Mason with the direct gaze of a leader accustomed to making judgments about potential threats or allies. "You are welcome here, Mason Coleman," he said in surprisingly good English. "My cousin says you fought against our enemy and helped bring Sina home." Mason dismounted, standing face to face with the Apache leader. "They helped me as much as I helped them," he replied honestly. "We wouldn't have made it without each other." Nantai nodded, apparently approving of this response. Equality and friendship is good foundation. He glanced at Storm, a flicker of recognition crossing his features. "The horse, he was born in these mountains, one of our best. Now he returns, bringing you with him." The observation echoed what Sina had told him earlier, that Storm had chosen him, that the horse somehow knew what it was doing when it brought them together. Mason had dismissed it as poetic thinking at the time, but now standing in this hidden valley with the remarkable journey behind them, he wasn't so sure. "3 men still follow," Nakohe interjected, his expression serious. "Cross black rocks. Maybe reach canyon by nightfall." Nantai's face hardened. "Then we prepare. They will not take anyone from this place." He turned to the gathered people, speaking rapidly in Apache. Immediately there was organized movement, women gathering children and moving toward the more defensible structures, men collecting weapons, young scouts dispatching to watch the approaches to the valley. "Your wound needs proper care," Nantai said to Mason, gesturing toward the blood stain on his shirt. "And you all need rest. Come." As they moved deeper into the camp, Mason felt Sina's hand slip into his, a gesture of reassurance and perhaps something more. He glanced at her, finding her eyes already on him, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Home," she said simply. "Both of us." The word resonated within Mason, awakening feelings he had thought permanently buried in Sarah's Texas grave. Home, not just a place, but a state of belonging, of connection to others, of purpose, beyond mere survival. His hand moved unconsciously to the pocket containing Sarah's letter. But this time the gesture was different, not seeking comfort from the past, but acknowledging it as he prepared to step into a future he had never imagined. Storm nickered softly beside him, as if in approval of his thoughts. Mason stroked the horse's neck, grateful for the animal's role in bringing him to this unexpected crossroads. Whatever came next, whether confrontation with their pursuers or integration into this hidden community, he would face it with a newfound clarity. For the first time since leaving Sarah's grave, Mason Coleman felt truly alive. They followed Nantai through the settlement, the curious eyes of the community following their progress. Children peeked out from behind their mothers' skirts, some pointing at Mason with undisguised interest. He was clearly a novelty here, perhaps the first white man many of them had seen up close, who wasn't a soldier or an enemy. Nantai led them to a substantial dwelling built against the base of a cliff. Its construction a blend of natural cave and human-made walls of stone and timber. Inside it was surprisingly spacious, with multiple rooms separated by hanging hides and woven partitions. A central fire pit provided both light and warmth, the smoke rising to exit through a cleverly designed opening in the roof. "Rest here," Nantai said, gesturing to prepared pallets of soft furs and blankets. "Food comes soon. Then we talk about those who follow." As their host departed, Nakohe moved to follow, apparently needing to confer with his cousin about the camp's defenses. Sina remained with Mason, guiding him to sit on one of the pallets. Without ceremony, she began to examine his wound again, her touch gentle but thorough as she removed the bandage he had applied earlier. "Better than I expected," she murmured, probing the edges of the injury with careful fingers. "But needs cleaning. Wait here." She disappeared through the dwelling's entrance, returning moments later with a clay bowl of water and a collection of herbs and roots similar to those she had used during their journey. With practiced efficiency, she prepared a poultice, working in silence, but with an energy that suggested contentment rather than weariness. "You're happy to be back with your people," Mason observed. Sina looked up from her work, a smile transforming her serious features. "Yes, thought maybe never see them again. After Blackwood." She trailed off, the memory of her captivity briefly clouding her expression. "But now, here, safe." "What will happen now?" Mason asked the question, encompassing both their immediate situation with the pursuers and the longer-term question of his place in this community. Sina considered this as she applied the poultice to his wound. "Tonight we deal with followers. Nantai will have plan." Her eyes met his, steady and clear. "After you decide, stay or go." The directness of her statement caught Mason off guard. He had been so focused on reaching safety on escaping Blackwood's men that he hadn't fully considered what would come next. The option to stay to build a life here among the Apache was one he hadn't allowed himself to contemplate seriously. "Would I be welcome?" he asked quietly. "Truly welcome, not just tolerated." Sina's hands paused in their work, her expression thoughtful. "Not easy. Some remember too much hurt from white men." She resumed binding his wound with fresh bandages. "But Nantai's word is strong, and you proved yourself friend." Her eyes met his again, something deeper than gratitude in their dark depths. "I speak for you, too." The simple declaration carried significant weight. Mason understood enough of Apache culture from his military days to know that vouching for an outsider was no small matter. It meant tying one's own reputation and standing to the behavior of another. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate for the emotion behind them. "For everything." A hint of color touched Sina's cheeks, but she maintained her steady gaze. "You save me. I save you. Now we even." The moment was interrupted by the arrival of a young woman carrying a tray of food roasted meat, some kind of bread, and a steaming tea that gave off an herbal aroma. She set it down beside them, her curious eyes lingering on Mason, before she withdrew with a respectful nod to Sina. They ate in companionable silence, the simple food tasting better than any meal Mason could remember. The exhaustion of their long journey began to catch up with him as his hunger was satisfied, his eyelids growing heavy, despite the lingering tension of knowing their pursuers were still out there. Sina noticed his fatigue. "Sleep," she urged. "Need strength for night." Mason didn't argue, stretching out on the pallet, the colt still within easy reach despite the relative safety of their surroundings. Old habits died hard. As his eyes closed, he was aware of Sina settling on a nearby pallet, her presence a comforting anchor in this unfamiliar place. His last thought before sleep claimed him was of Sarah's letter in his pocket, and how its meaning seemed to be transforming with each passing day from a tether to grief to a permission to live again. Mason dreamed of two women standing side by side, Sarah with her gentle smile and quiet strength, Sina with her fierce determination and healing hands. They weren't in competition in the dream, but rather in some sort of harmony, as if passing a torch between them. When he looked down, he saw that the torch was actually his own heart, damaged but still beating, being carefully transferred from Sarah's protective grasp to Sina's healing one. He woke to Nakohe's hand on his shoulder, the young Apache's expression grave in the dim light of the banked fire. Outside, the last glow of sunset had faded to full darkness. "They come," Nakohe said simply. "Nantai calls council." I've completed part 2 of The Woman on Wild Horse, 7,000 words, continuing the story based on your enhanced outline. This section follows Mason, Sina, and Nakohe's journey as they escape their pursuers, deepen their relationships, and finally reach the hidden Apache camp. The writing maintains the cinematic emotional style with strong imagery and measured pacing. I've developed the psychological depths of the characters, especially Mason's gradual healing from his past trauma and his growing connection with Sina. The subplot about Storm's connection to the Apache people continues to develop, and I've included several quiet moments of emotional connection amid the action. Would you like me to continue with part 3 now? The final section would cover the confrontation with the remaining pursuers and resolve Mason's decision about his future with Sina and the Apache community. Mason rose quickly, his soldier's instincts taking over despite the lingering ache in his side. Sina was already up, adjusting the knife at her belt, her movements calm but purposeful. Outside, they could hear the low murmur of voices as the camp prepared for the approaching threat. "How many?" Mason asked, checking the Colt's loading. "Still 3, Nakohe replied. "Reached canyon entrance at sunset. Moving slow, careful." It made tactical sense. The pursuers would be wary of ambush in unfamiliar territory, especially approaching an Apache camp. Their caution might give the defenders valuable time to prepare. They followed Nakohe through the settlement to a larger structure at its center, clearly a meeting place for the community. Inside, a fire burned low, casting flickering shadows on the faces of those gathered around it. Nantai sat at the head of the circle, his weathered features solemn in the firelight. Several older men flanked him, their expressions equally grave, while younger warriors stood attentively behind them. Mason recognized the gathering for what it was, a war council hastily convened to address the immediate threat. He felt acutely aware of his outsider status as he entered the conversations, pausing momentarily as eyes turned to evaluate him. But Nantai's gesture of welcome was clear, indicating a place in the circle for Mason and his companions. As they settled, Nantai spoke in Apache, then switched to English for Mason's benefit. The watchers report 3 men approaching through the lower canyon. They move like soldiers with rifles and pistols. One, is wounded, limping. He looked directly at Mason. "You know these men." It wasn't a question. Mason nodded. "The wounded one would be Jenkins Blackwood's second. I shot him during our escape from my cabin." He paused, considering what else might be useful. "He's dangerous, but not as clever as Blackwood was. The others are likely territorial militia or bounty hunters recruited to track us down." "Why they follow so far?" one of the older men asked, his English heavily accented. "For bounty only." It was a perceptive question. The territory was vast, with plenty of easier targets than 3 fugitives who had already proven willing to kill to maintain their freedom. The persistence of their pursuers suggested something beyond a simple bounty hunt. "Revenge," Mason said simply. "I killed Blackwood. He may have had friends or at least business partners who want to settle the score." Nantai nodded as if this confirmed his own assessment. Men driven by revenge not stop easily, not listen to reason. "No," Mason agreed. "They won't." The council fell silent, each member contemplating the implications. It was Sina who broke the silence, her voice clear in the quiet space. "These men threaten not just us. Threaten all here." She looked around the circle, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. "If they find this place, more will come. Always more." Her words carried the weight of bitter experience. Mason saw heads nodding around the fire. These people had lived through enough raids and relocations to understand the danger of discovery. Their hidden valley had remained safe precisely because it remained hidden. Nantai leaned forward, his hands extended toward the fire in a gesture that encompassed the entire gathering. "We have 3 choices. Fight them here, in our home. Meet them in the canyon before they reach us. Or slip away in darkness, find new place to hide." The last option clearly pained him, though Mason understood its logic. Moving an entire community would be difficult and dangerous, but perhaps less so than engaging in open conflict that might attract even more attention. "What of the woman and children?" an older warrior asked. "If we fight and lose, they suffer." It was the eternal dilemma of those forced to defend their homes, how to ensure the safety of the most vulnerable while standing against threats that couldn't be ignored. Mason had seen it play out in settlements across the frontier and during the war in villages caught between opposing forces. Nakohe spoke up, his young voice respectful but firm. "We have advantage. No terrain. They blind in darkness. And they expect pursuit, not ambush." Mason added tactical possibilities forming in his mind. "They'll be looking behind them, not ahead." A thoughtful silence followed as the council considered these points. Finally, Nantai raised his hand, drawing all eyes to him. "We will not abandon our home," he declared, "nor will we wait for danger to enter our lodge." He looked to the younger warriors. "We meet them in the canyon where stone walls fight with us, not against us." The decision made the council turn to planning. Maps were drawn in the dirt floor positions, assigned strategies discussed. Mason found himself included naturally in the tactical conversation, his military experience respected, despite his outsider status. It was a novel feeling to be valued for his knowledge without the burden of command that had weighed on him during the war. As the council concluded, warriors dispersed to prepare collecting weapons and moving toward assigned positions. Nantai approached Mason, Sina, and Nakohe, his expression solemn but determined. "My cousin says you are skilled with rifle," he said to Mason. "We have position for you if willing." Mason nodded without hesitation. "I'll help however I can." Nantai's weathered face softened slightly. "Not your fight by blood or tribe, yet you stand with us." "It became my fight when Jenkins and his men pursued us here," Mason replied. And when they threatened Sina, something passed between them, an understanding between men who had both seen enough conflict to value those who stood firm when easier paths were available. Nantai clasped Mason's arm in the same gesture he had used with Nakohe, earlier a warrior's acknowledgement. Then we fight together. He turned to Sina. Healers, prepare for wounded. You join them. Sina shook her head firmly. I fight too. Know these men, what they do. Nantai studied her for a moment, then nodded. As you wish. Each defends in own way. As the Apache leader moved away to coordinate other aspects of the defense, Mason found himself alone with Sina and Nakohe. The young man checked his weapons one last time, then spoke quietly to his sister in their language before departing with a respectful nod to Mason. He goes to scout, Sina explained. Lead warriors to best positions. Mason nodded, impressed again by the young man's skills and composure. He's a good man. Brave. Yes, Sina agreed, pride evident in her voice. Born leader, like our father. She touched the knife at her belt, a gesture that seemed almost unconscious. I go soon, too. Position near narrow place in canyon. Mason felt a sudden reluctance to let her out of his sight, though he knew she was more than capable of defending herself. The feeling surprised him. It wasn't just concern for an ally, but something deeper, more personal. Be careful, he said, the words inadequate for what he wanted to express. Sina looked at him with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see more than he intended to reveal. You also. She hesitated, then reached into a small pouch at her waist, withdrawing what appeared to be a leather cord with a small stone pendant. Take this. Mason accepted the offering, examining it in the firelight. The pendant was a piece of polished turquoise, wrapped in an intricate pattern of thin silver wire. It was beautiful in its simplicity, clearly an item of personal significance. What is it? He asked. Protection, Sina replied. From my mother, given when I became woman. Her eyes held his. Now yours. The gift carried weight far beyond the physical object. It was a piece of her history, her identity freely given. Mason felt humbled by the gesture, uncertain if he deserved such trust. I can't take this, he began. It's too... Sina placed her hand over his, closing his fingers around the pendant. Can and will, she said firmly. Survived this long, will help you do same. Before Mason could respond, a young warrior appeared at the entrance, calling Sina's name. Her time to move into position had come. She squeezed Mason's hand once more, then turned away, pausing only briefly at the doorway to look back at him before disappearing into the darkness. Mason stood alone for a moment, the pendant warm in his palm, a strange mix of emotions coursing through him. Concern for the coming conflict, admiration for the courage of these people who had accepted him despite every reason for suspicion, and something else, something centered on Sina that he wasn't quite ready to name. A different warrior appeared, gesturing for Mason to follow. It was time to take his own position in the defense of the hidden valley. He slipped Sina's pendant over his head, tucking it beneath his shirt, where it rested against his skin, then checked the colt one last time before stepping out into the night. The warrior led him along a twisting path that climbed the canyon wall, eventually reaching a narrow ledge that overlooked the approach from the south. From this vantage point, Mason could see much of the canyon floor silvered now in the light of a rising moon. The natural bottleneck where the canyon narrowed was clearly visible about 100 yards downstream, an ideal position for an ambush. Another figure waited on the ledge, an older man with a Winchester rifle, who nodded to Mason as he approached. The warrior who had guided him spoke briefly to the older man in Apache, then disappeared back down the path, leaving the two of them alone on the outcropping. I am Haskey, the man introduced himself, his English accented but clear. Was scout for army long time ago. before they break promise. Mason understood the implicit history in those few words. The man had cooperated with the U.S. military during an earlier, less hostile phase of relations, only to see agreements violated and promises broken as settlement pressures increased. "Mason Coleman," he replied, "former Union cavalry." Haskey nodded unsurprised. "Nantai say you good with rifle. We watch canyon together. You see there?" He pointed to the narrowest part of the passage below. "They must pass there. No other way." It was indeed the perfect ambush point, steep walls on either side creating a funnel that would force their pursuers to proceed in single file with limited visibility and no cover. Mason studied the terrain, noting potential escape routes and firing positions. "Your people are positioned on both sides?" he asked. "Yes, some above, some below. We'll close like trap." Haskey's weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes gleamed with a fierce satisfaction. "They hunt us many years. Tonight, we hunt them." They settled into watchful silence, the Winchester and Mason's Colt, ready, but not yet needed. The night deepened around them, the only sounds the occasional cry of a night bird and the soft whisper of wind through the canyon. Time stretched, measured only by the slow movement of stars across the sky and the gradual shift of moonlight on the rocks below. Mason found himself thinking of Sina somewhere in the darkness, waiting, as he was, for the approaching confrontation. The pendant she had given him seemed to pulse warmly against his skin, a tangible connection to her even in separation. His hand moved to touch it through his shirt, drawing comfort from its presence. Haskey noticed the gesture. "Gift from woman," he observed quietly. "Strong medicine." Mason nodded, not bothering to deny it. "Sina gave it to me before she took her position." A flicker of surprise crossed the older man's face, quickly controlled. "Sina not give such thing lightly. Her mother's from before soldiers came." "I know," Mason replied. "I tried to refuse." Haskey studied him with renewed interest. "Yet she insist. Means much." Before Mason could respond, a subtle movement from Haskey silenced him. The older man had stiffened, his attention fixed on the canyon floor below. Mason followed his gaze, straining to see what had alerted his companion. There a shadow moving against shadows, barely perceptible in the moonlight. Then another, and a third. Their pursuers had arrived, moving with the cautious deliberation of men who sensed danger but couldn't identify its source. Haskey made a soft sound between his teeth, not quite a whistle, but a signal nonetheless. From across the canyon came an answering sound so subtle that Mason might have missed it if he hadn't been listening for it. The Apache were communicating their readiness, positioning themselves as the intruders approached the narrowest part of the passage. Through the silvery darkness, Mason could now make out individual figures. 3 men moving in single file, rifles held ready, checking the canyon walls as they advanced. The lead figure was stocky, moving with a pronounced limp that confirmed their identity. Jenkins had indeed survived his wound and pursued them all this way. Mason's finger tightened on the trigger of the Colt, a surge of anger rising at the sight of the man who had helped Blackwood in his atrocities and who now threatened Sina and her people. It would be easy to fire from this position to end the threat with a single shot. But he held back, following the plan developed in the council. The trap would close at the narrowest point, not before. The 3 men continued forward, unaware of the watchers positioned above them. Their progress was slow, each step taken with careful consideration, their attention divided between the path ahead and the possibility of pursuit from behind. They were experienced enough to be cautious, but not wise enough to have turned back while they still could. As they reached the narrowest section of the canyon, Jenkins halted, raising his hand to stop his companions. He seemed to sense something, an instinctive wariness that had likely kept him alive through years of dangerous work. Mason could see him scanning the canyon walls, his posture tense, rifle ready. For a heart-stopping moment, Mason thought the man might turn back, might somehow evade the trap so carefully laid. But then Jenkins shook his head and motioned his companions forward again, apparently dismissing his concerns as mere nerves. They moved into the choke point, the walls rising steeply on either side, the moonlight creating deep shadows that concealed the positioned warriors. Haskell raised the Winchester to his shoulder, sighting carefully. Mason readied the Colt, knowing its range was limited, but prepared to use it if necessary. The silence was broken by a sharp whistle from the canyon floor, the signal to spring the ambush. Instantly, warriors emerged from concealed positions blocking both ends of the narrow passage. The three intruders froze, caught in the trap, their rifles swinging wildly as they tried to identify the greatest threat. "Drop your weapons!" Mason called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "You're surrounded." Jenkins looked up, his face visible now in the moonlight, the same cruel features Mason remembered from the confrontation at the cabin, twisted now with anger and surprise. "Coleman!" he snarled, raising his rifle toward the sound of Mason's voice. Haskell fired first, the Winchester cracking sharply in the confined space. Jenkins staggered, but didn't fall, returning fire wildly, his shot ricocheting off the rocks near Mason's position. The other two intruders were firing as well, spinning to engage the Apache warriors who had appeared behind them. The canyon erupted in gunfire and shouted orders, the confined space magnifying each sound into a deafening cacophony. Mason fired the Colt, aiming carefully despite the chaos conscious of the Apache warriors who might be in his line of fire. His first shot missed, but his second caught one of Jenkins's companions in the shoulder, sending the man's rifle clattering to the stones. From his elevated position, Mason could see the entire confrontation unfolding like a macabre stage play. The Apache warriors were disciplined, firing only when they had clear shots, gradually tightening the circle around the intruders. Jenkins and his remaining able-bodied companion fought back desperately, but they were outnumbered and in an indefensible position. Mason was searching for another clear shot when he spotted a familiar figure moving along the canyon floor. Sina approaching from behind the intruders, a knife gleaming in her hand. She moved with the silent grace of a hunting cat, using the shadows for cover, clearly intending to flank the embattled men. But Jenkins was a survivor attuned to danger from years of violent work. He sensed movement behind him and spun his rifle, swinging toward Sina before she could close the distance. Mason saw the movement, saw the threat to Sina, and reacted without conscious thought. He fired the Colt, not taking time to aim, carefully operating on pure instinct. The shot struck Jenkins in the side, spinning him half around and spoiling his aim. His rifle discharged harmlessly into the canyon wall. Sina didn't hesitate. She closed the remaining distance and struck with her knife, a swift, decisive movement that dropped Jenkins to his knees. The last of the intruders, seeing his companions fallen and surrounded by determined Apache warriors, threw down his weapon in surrender. The gunfire ceased abruptly, leaving only echoes reverberating through the canyon and the moans of the wounded. Mason scrambled down from his position, following a path that Haskell indicated, his heart pounding with the need to reach Sina to confirm she was unharmed. He found her standing over Jenkins, her knife bloody, but her expression composed. The bounty hunter lay on his side, clutching his wounds, his face contorted with pain and hatred. "You Apache-loving bastard!" Jenkins gasped, his eyes fixing on Mason as he approached. "Should have killed you at the cabin." "Yes," Mason agreed coldly. "You should have." Nantai appeared from among the warriors, surveying the scene with calm authority. He spoke briefly to several men who moved to secure the surviving intruder and check the condition of the wounded. Then he turned to Mason and Sina. "It is done," he said simply. Your enemies no longer threaten. Mason looked down at Jenkins, who was struggling to speak again, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. The man had been a willing participant in Blackwood's atrocities, had pursued them relentlessly, would have killed without hesitation. Yet Mason felt no satisfaction in his suffering, only a weary relief that the threat was ended. "What about him?" Mason asked, nodding toward the surviving intruder who knelt with his hands bound, fear evident in his pale face. Nantai's expression was unreadable. "Council will decide. Maybe send back with message, maybe not." The implications were clear. The man's fate hung in the balance, his life dependent on whether the Apache Council judged him a continuing threat. Mason couldn't find it in himself to argue for mercy, not after all that had transpired, yet he hoped the Council would choose the path that brought the least additional violence. As if reading his thoughts, Sina spoke quietly. "Blood calls for blood, but too much blood already spilled." She looked at Nantai. "Let him go. Tell others we gone. Moved far away." It was a clever suggestion, using the survivor as a messenger to spread misinformation, potentially directing any future searches away from the hidden valley. Nantai considered this, then nodded slowly. "Wise words will bring to council." He gestured to the warriors to take the prisoner back to the settlement, then turned his attention to Jenkins, who had fallen silent, his breathing labored. "This one not live long." Mason knew it was true. The combined injuries from his shot and Sina's knife were mortal, particularly in these conditions, far from any medical assistance. Jenkins would die here in this remote canyon, his quest for revenge unfulfilled. As if sensing their discussion, Jenkins forced his eyes open, focusing on Mason with evident effort. "Tell me one thing," he rasped. "Worth it, throwing everything away for these savages?" The slur drew a tightening of lips from Nantai and a flash of anger in Sina's eyes, but Mason felt only pity for a man who had lived and would die with such hatred in his heart. "Yes," he answered simply. "It was worth it." Jenkins's face twisted in incomprehension or perhaps pain, and then went slack as he lost consciousness. Mason knew he wouldn't wake again. Nantai signaled to several warriors who moved to deal with the body. The immediate crisis resolved, the Apache leader turned to Mason and Sina once more. "Return to settlement," he instructed. "Council meets at dawn. Much to decide." As Nantai moved away to oversee the final securing of the canyon, Mason found himself alone with Sina for the first time since the confrontation began. In the fading moonlight, her face showed the strain of the night's events, but also a profound relief that the long pursuit was finally ended. "You hit Jenkins," she said, looking at Mason with those penetrating eyes. "Before he could shoot me." Mason nodded. "I saw him turning toward you. There wasn't time to think." "Good shot. Far in darkness." She stepped closer, her hand rising to touch the place on his chest where her pendant rested beneath his shirt. "Protection worked." "Maybe," Mason acknowledged with a small smile. "Or maybe it was just luck." "No such thing as just luck," Sina replied, her expression serious. "Things happen for reason. Storm finding me, you helping us, all connected." It was a perspective Mason had heard expressed before in various forms by people seeking meaning in the seemingly random events of life. He had always been skeptical of such metaphysical explanations, preferring to credit human choice and circumstance over destiny or spiritual guidance. Yet standing here in this moonlit canyon, having survived against improbable odds, having found connection with this remarkable woman and her people after years of isolation, he couldn't entirely dismiss the possibility that some larger pattern might be at work. "Connected how?" he asked. Sina's hand remained on his chest, warm through the fabric of his shirt. Like stars, she said, glancing up at the night sky. Separate, but forming pattern together. Making new story. The poetic simplicity of her explanation touched something in Mason, a recognition that some truths might be better expressed through metaphor than logic. Whether by design or chance, their paths had indeed crossed and formed a pattern neither could have anticipated. "Come," Sina said, lowering her hand, but maintaining the connection through her gaze. "Long night. Need rest before council." They walked together back toward the settlement, the path illuminated by the setting moon and the first hint of dawn on the eastern horizon. Warriors moved around them, some returning to the camp, others remaining behind to ensure the canyon was secure. There was a quiet efficiency to their actions. A people accustomed to defending their freedom with minimal words or wasted motion. As they approached the dwelling where they had rested earlier, Mason found himself reluctant to part from Sina, though he knew they both needed sleep before the council meeting. She seemed to share his hesitation, pausing at the entrance, her eyes searching his face as if looking for answers to unasked questions. "Will you stay?" she asked finally, the simple query encompassing far more than the immediate decision of where to sleep. Mason understood. The deeper question was, he planning to remain with the Apache now that the immediate danger had passed? Or would he return to his solitary existence once the council had concluded its business? It was a question he had been asking himself since they arrived at the hidden valley. The life he had built at his isolated cabin seemed distant now, a self-imposed exile that had served its purpose in helping him survive Sarah's death, but now felt increasingly like a prison rather than a refuge. Yet remaining here would mean embracing a completely different existence, one that would challenge him in ways he couldn't fully anticipate. He would always be an outsider to some degree, his acceptance dependent on proving himself worthy of the trust Nantai and Sina had extended. "I don't know yet," he answered honestly. "There's much to consider." Sina nodded, neither disappointed nor surprised by his response. "Decision not made in tiredness," she agreed. "Rest now. Think later." She touched his arm briefly, then entered the dwelling, leaving Mason alone with his thoughts. He remained outside for a moment, looking up at the stars Sina had referenced, separate points of light forming patterns that humans had been interpreting for millennia. Perhaps she was right about connections, about new stories being written in the confluence of individual journeys. With that thought, he followed her inside, finding his assigned pallet and stretching out his weary body. Despite the tumult of emotions and unanswered questions, sleep claimed him, quickly, deep and dreamless. Dawn broke clear and cool, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the dwelling's smoke hole to touch Mason's face. He woke instantly, a lifetime of military and frontier habits asserting themselves even in these unfamiliar surroundings. Sina was already up her pallet, empty, the sounds of activity outside indicating the settlement was fully awake and preparing for the day ahead. Mason rose, checking his wound, which had held up well during the night's exertions. He retrieved the Colt now, with only 2 rounds remaining after the canyon confrontation, and stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The settlement was alive with purposeful movement, women tending cooking fires, children carrying water, men repairing weapons, or discussing the night's events in low voices. There was a sense of tension underlying the routine activities, an awareness that important decisions would be made this day that might affect the entire community. Mason spotted Nakohe emerging from a dwelling across the central area, his arm freshly bandaged. Apparently, the young man had sustained a minor wound during the fight, though it hadn't prevented him from returning to the settlement under his own power. He nodded to Mason, his expression somber, but not unfriendly. "Council soon," Nakohe said as he approached. "Nantai asks you come." "Of course," Mason replied. "How is your arm?" Nakohe glanced at the bandage dismissively. "Small cut. Nothing." His eyes held a hint of respect that hadn't been there before. "Haski says you shoot well. Help protect Sina." It was clearly an acknowledgement of Mason's contribution to the night's success, perhaps even a tentative step toward acceptance. Mason nodded, accepting the implied gratitude without embellishment. "We all did what was needed," he said simply. A hint of a smile touched Nakohe's serious face. "Yes, together." That single word carried significant weight, suggesting that Mason was at least provisionally considered part of the collective we rather than a separate entity. It was a subtle but meaningful shift. Nakohe led him to the central meeting place where the previous night's council had been held. Already many of the same participants were gathering Nantai and the older men who seemed to serve as his advisors, warriors who had distinguished themselves in the canyon defense, and a few older women whose bearing suggested positions of respect within the community. Sina was there as well, seated near Nantai, her expression composed, but her eyes finding Mason's immediately as he entered. She wore a clean dress of soft deerskin, her hair arranged in two neat braids, a simple silver and turquoise necklace similar to the pendant she had given Mason, her only adornment. In the morning light, away from the tension of pursuit and confrontation, she looked both formidable and beautiful. Mason took the place indicated for him, conscious of his status as both guest and subject of discussion. The council would be deciding not only what to do about the surviving intruder, but also implicitly whether Mason would be welcome to stay among them. Nantai opened the proceedings, speaking first in Apache, then switching to English as he had the previous night, a courtesy to Mason that didn't go unnoticed. "The threat that followed our people has been ended." He began, his deep voice carrying easily in the quiet space. "2 are dead. 1 remains under guard." He paused, allowing those assembled to consider this outcome. There were nods of approval, though no overt celebrations. Death even of enemies was not treated lightly here. "Sina suggests we let this man go to carry false message that we have left this place," Nantai continued. "Others say he must die to ensure silence." He looked around the circle. "Council must decide." An older man spoke up, his face deeply lined with age and experience. "If he lives, he talks. More soldiers come." "If he dies," countered a middle-aged woman, "and does not return, they send more to find missing men." It was the eternal dilemma of irregular warfare, whether eliminating enemies solved problems or created new ones. Mason had seen both outcomes during the war and after, had participated in decisions that sometimes proved wise, sometimes disastrous. "What does white man say?" someone asked, eyes turning to Mason. "He knows soldier thinking." Mason hadn't expected to be consulted so directly. He considered carefully before responding, aware that lives hung on his assessment. "If he disappears, they'll send a larger force to investigate," he acknowledged. "But if he returns with a story of being ambushed far from here by a band supposedly moving north into the mountains, they might focus their attention elsewhere." Nantai nodded thoughtfully. "But can we trust this man to tell story we give him?" It was a critical question. The surviving intruder would need to be convincingly frightened enough to avoid returning, yet not so traumatized that authorities would doubt his account. "Fear is strong persuasion," Sina observed quietly. "Make him believe worse happens if he speaks truth." There were murmurs of agreement around the circle. The Apache had generations of experience in psychological warfare, in using an enemy's fears and preconceptions against them. A carefully staged release, with the right mixture of intimidation and misinformation, might indeed serve their purposes better than execution. After further discussion, the council reached consensus, The prisoner would be taken blindfolded on a circuitous route away from the valley, given a frightening but carefully constructed story of a large Apache band moving northward, and released with just enough supplies to reach a settlement if he traveled quickly. With that matter decided, the council's attention shifted to Mason himself. Nantai addressed him directly. "Mason Coleman, you fought beside us, helped end threat to our people." The Apache leader's weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes held a glint of what might have been approval. "Now must decide what comes next." The question hung in the air, its implications clear to everyone present. Mason felt the weight of multiple gazes upon him, none more penetrating than Sina's. The decision he had contemplated during the night now demanded an answer. "I am grateful for your acceptance," he began carefully. "Few would have shown such trust to a stranger, especially one from a people who have caused yours so much suffering." Nantai inclined his head slightly, acknowledging both the gratitude and the historical context. "Judge each by own actions, not by tribe or color," he said, repeating what Sina had told Mason earlier. "You proved yourself, friend." "Thank you," Mason replied sincerely. "But I need to consider what my place would be here if I were to stay. I don't want to be a burden or a source of danger to your people." An older woman spoke up, her English, halting but clear. "White man who lives with Apache always brings danger. Question is whether worth it." It was a blunt but honest assessment. Mason's continued presence would inevitably complicate the community's security calculations. If discovered, his decision to live among the Apache would be viewed by territorial authorities as treasonous at worst, suspicious at best. "What skills you bring?" asked one of the warriors who had fought alongside Mason in the canyon. "Besides shooting." It was a practical question focused on what Mason could contribute to the community's survival, rather than abstract concerns about his background. He appreciated the directness. "I can hunt, build, repair weapons," Mason replied. "I served as a farrier during the war, so I know horses. I can read and write English, which might be useful in understanding official documents or communicating with authorities if ever needed." These were tangible contributions, practical skills that any frontier community would value. But Mason knew that integration into Apache society would require more than just useful abilities. It would demand a genuine commitment to their way of life and values. Sina, who had remained silent during most of the discussion, finally spoke. "He learns quick, respects our ways, not try to change or judge." Her eyes met Mason's across the circle. "Has good heart, sees people not just Apache or white." Her endorsement carried significant weight, both because of her status as a healer and because of her direct experience with Mason throughout their journey. Several heads nodded around the circle, apparently accepting her assessment. Nantai raised his hand, drawing attention back to himself. "Decision is two parts," he said. "First, does council accept Mason Coleman to live among us if he chooses?" He looked around the gathering. "Second, does Mason Coleman choose to stay?" The first question was put to a vote, each council member indicating their position with a simple gesture, a raised hand for acceptance, a flat palm for rejection. Mason watched his heart beating faster than he would have expected as hands rose around the circle. Not every member voted for acceptance, but a clear majority did, including Nantai Sina and Nakohe. "Council has spoken," Nantai declared. "Mason Coleman welcome to stay among Chiricahua people if he chooses." He turned to Mason. "Now, second question. What does your heart say?" All eyes turned to Mason, waiting for his response. It was a moment of decision that would alter the course of his life irrevocably. To stay meant abandoning the isolated existence he had built, embracing a new community and culture, and potentially cutting ties with his own society. To leave meant returning to solitude, to the cabin where memories of Sarah lingered in every corner to days, measured only by the basic tasks of survival. His hand moved unconsciously to touch Sina's pendant beneath his shirt, feeling its contours through the fabric. The simple object had come to represent something larger, a connection to this woman and her people, a bridge between his past and a possible future he had never imagined. Mason's thoughts turned to Sarah, to the letter he had carried for 3 years. "I'm waiting for you to come home, my love." Those words had haunted him, tethered him to grief and guilt. But perhaps, as he had begun to realize during their journey, Sarah hadn't been waiting for him to join her in death, but to find a new home for his heart in life. He looked at Sina, seeing in her eyes not demand or expectation, but patient, waiting, the same quiet strength she had demonstrated throughout their shared ordeal. She would accept his decision either way, he knew, but her preference was clear in the softening of her expression as their gazes held. "I choose to stay," Mason said finally, the words feeling right as they left his lips. "If you'll teach me your ways, I'll do my best to honor them and to contribute to this community." A murmur of approval ran through the gathering. Nantai nodded satisfaction evident in his usually impassive features. "Good. It is decided." The council concluded shortly after members dispersing to their various responsibilities. The immediate crises had been resolved, decisions made, a path forward established. Life in the Hidden Valley would continue, altered by recent events, but not defined by them. As Mason stood to leave the council area, Sina approached him, her expression containing a mixture of emotions, pleasure at his decision certainly, but also a careful restraint, as if unwilling to presume too much. "You stay," she said simply. Mason nodded. "Yes, it feels like the right choice." "Not easy path," Sina cautioned. "Many things to learn. Some people still not trust." "I know," Mason acknowledged, "but nothing worthwhile comes easily." A small smile touched her lips. True words. She glanced toward the edge of the settlement, where the twin peaks that marked the valley could be seen rising against the blue sky. "Walk with me, show you more of new home." Mason accepted the invitation, falling into step beside her as they moved away from the central area. Children watched them curiously as they passed, some waving shyly when Sina acknowledged them. Women tending cooking fires or working on crafts nodded respectfully, their expressions revealing varying degrees of acceptance and reservation. "They'll get used to me eventually," Mason observed. "Yes," Sina agreed. "Time and actions speak louder than words." They followed a path that led upward along one of the valley walls, climbing steadily until they reached a natural shelf in the rock face that offered a panoramic view of the entire settlement. From this vantage point, Mason could appreciate the careful planning that had gone into establishing the hidden community, its placement sheltered from winter winds, its water source reliable, its approaches easily defended. "Beautiful," he said, taking in the vista. "Yes," Sina replied, but when Mason glanced at her, he found she wasn't looking at the valley, but at him, her dark eyes warm with an emotion he was finally ready to acknowledge. "Sina," he began suddenly, uncertain how to express the feelings that had been growing within him since their journey began. "I want you to know that my decision to stay isn't just about the community. It's also—" She placed her fingers gently against his lips, silencing him. "Know already," she said softly. "See it in your eyes. Way you look at me. Way you touch pendant." Mason smiled against her fingers, not surprised that she had read him so clearly. From their first meeting, she had seen more in him than he had sometimes been willing to acknowledge himself. "Is it too soon?" he asked when she lowered her hand. "After everything that's happened," Sina considered this thoughtfully. "Life not wait for perfect time," she replied. Too much lost already. For both. She touched the pendant through his shirt, her hand warm against his chest. Hearts know own time. It was a wisdom Mason couldn't dispute. He had spent 3 years waiting, holding himself apart from life, in a kind of suspended animation. Now, having faced death alongside this remarkable woman, having seen her courage and compassion, her strength and vulnerability, he felt more alive than he had since Sarah's death. Slowly giving her time to withdraw if she chose, Mason raised his hand to Sina's face, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek. She leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his, a silent permission and invitation. When their lips met, it was gentle at first, a tentative exploration of new territory for both of them. Then Sina's arms encircled his neck, and the kiss deepened into something more profound, not just a physical connection, but a promise, a beginning. They separated after a long moment, both a little breathless, but remained close, foreheads touching, sharing the same air. Mason felt a lightness in his chest that had been absent for years, a sense of possibility that transcended the challenges he knew lay ahead. "What happens now?" he asked. Sina smiled, the expression transforming her serious features. "Now we live," she said simply, "day by day. Build something new." It wouldn't be easy. Mason harbored no illusions about the difficulties they would face, cultural differences to navigate lingering suspicions, to overcome the constant threat of discovery by authorities hostile to the Apache. But standing here with Sina, looking out over the hidden valley that had offered sanctuary when they most needed it, he felt equal to those challenges. "There's something I need to do first," Mason said, reaching into his pocket where Sarah's letter had resided for 3 years. The paper was still damp from the river crossing, the ink beginning to blur, the creases weakening from constant handling. "A farewell I've put off too long." Sina watched with understanding as he carefully unfolded the letter for what he knew would be the final time. The words were familiar, etched into his memory through countless readings, but now he saw them with new eyes. "My dearest Mason, the doctor says I haven't much time left. The fever has taken too strong a hold, and my body grows weaker each day. I wish more than anything that you were here beside me, but I understand why you cannot be. Your duty holds you elsewhere, as it has so often during our years together. Please, don't blame yourself when you receive this news. We both knew the risks of separation during these troubled times. I have no regrets about our life together, short though it has been. You gave me joy, respect, and love beyond measure. I'm waiting for you to come home, my love, but not to join me too soon in whatever lies beyond this life. I'm waiting for you to find home again in your heart, to build something new from the foundation of what we shared. You have too much love to offer this world to keep it locked away in grief. Remember me, but live fully. That is my final wish for you. Forever yours." Sarah Mason had read these words hundreds of times, but had stopped truly seeing them after the first few readings, fixating instead on what he perceived as his failure to be there when Sarah needed him most. Now, with Sina beside him and a new beginning before him, he finally understood what his wife had been trying to tell him. She hadn't been reproaching him or demanding that he live in perpetual mourning. She had been releasing him, giving him permission to find happiness again when he was ready. It had taken 3 years, a journey across harsh wilderness, and the intervention of an Apache woman and her remarkable horse for him to truly hear Sarah's message. With gentle reverence, Mason folded the letter one last time, then turned toward the edge of the rock shelf, where a small juniper grew from a crack in the stone. He tucked the letter securely among its branches, where wind and weather would eventually return the paper to the elements. "Goodbye, Sarah," he said softly. "Thank you for waiting." Sina stood silently beside him, respecting the moment of farewell. When Mason turned back to her, she took his hand, her fingers warm and strong against his. "She sounds like wise woman," Sina observed. "Would have liked to know her." "She would have liked you too," Mason replied, surprised to find he meant it. The two women were different in many ways, but shared a fundamental strength and clarity that transcended their disparate backgrounds. They remained on the rock shelf for a time, hands joined, looking out over the hidden valley where Mason would build his new life. Storm was visible in a small corral below his black coat, gleaming in the sunlight, his head raised as if sensing their presence. The horse that had once belonged to the Apache had been stolen by Blackwood, had carried Mason faithfully for years, and had finally brought Sina to his door, completing a circle none of them could have foreseen. "Sina was right," Mason said, nodding toward the horse. "Things are connected. Storm brought us together for a reason." Sina smiled, squeezing his hand. "Apache horse knows way home." It was true in more ways than one. Storm had found his way back to the people who had raised him, and in doing so had guided Mason to a home he hadn't known he was seeking. As the sun climbed higher in the clear autumn sky, they descended from their vantage point, returning to the settlement where life continued its rhythms despite the recent disruptions. There would be much to learn, many adjustments to make, bridges to build between Mason's past and his future among the Chiricahua. But for the first time in 3 years, he looked forward to the days ahead with anticipation rather than resignation. The wound in his side was healing. The pendant Sina had given him rested warm against his skin, and Sarah's letter had finally delivered its message of release. Mason Coleman, once a solitary man haunted by grief, had found his way home, not to a place but to a people, to a woman, to a purpose larger than mere survival. The journey had been unlikely dangerous, transformative. Yet, as he walked beside Sina through the hidden valley, he knew with certainty that it had been worth every step. Later that evening, as stars appeared in the darkening sky, Mason stood outside the dwelling that would now be his home. Sina was inside preparing herbs for tomorrow's healing work, her quiet movements visible through the doorway. The sounds of the settlement settling for the night surrounded him. Quiet conversations, children being called to bed, the soft nickering of horses in their corral. Storm approached the fence as Mason drew near, stretching his neck to greet his rider. Mason stroked the horse's sleek neck, feeling the powerful muscles beneath the smooth coat. "Thank you, old friend," he murmured, "for bringing her to me, for bringing us home." The horse nudged him gently, as if in acknowledgement, then turned and moved back into the corral, rejoining the small herd of Apache horses that had accepted him as one of their own. Mason looked up at the star-filled sky, thinking of Sina's words about separate lights forming meaningful patterns. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps all the disparate elements of his life, the war, Sarah's death, his years of isolation, Storm's mysterious disappearance, the appearance of Sina at his door, were not random events, but points in a constellation he was only now beginning to recognize. From the doorway, Sina called his name, her voice warm in the cool evening air. Mason turned from the stars to the earthly light that awaited him, ready at last to step fully into the life he had chosen. The woman on the wild horse had led him home. I've completed the final part of The Woman on Wild Horse, 7,000 words, concluding the story as outlined. This section resolves the confrontation with the pursuers, shows Mason's decision to stay with Sina and the Apache community, and provides emotional closure regarding his past with Sarah. The writing maintains the cinematic and emotional style throughout, with strong visual imagery and measured pacing. I've included several quiet moments of reflection amid the action, particularly in the final scenes where Mason says goodbye to Sarah's memory and embraces his new life. The story comes full circle with Storm the horse that connected Mason and Cena, now returned to his original home with the Apache people. The psychological depths of all characters are maintained through the conclusion, with Mason's healing journey complete, as he finally understands Sarah's final message and opens himself to a new beginning with Cena. This concludes the complete 21,000-word story as requested following your enhanced outline while maintaining the original setting themes and character development.